Chapter 1. The Trial That Changed Everything. Sirius Black could have run. 30 hours ago, when he'd discovered Peter's empty hiding place and known with sick certainty that everything had gone wrong, he could have disapparated to France, to America, to anywhere beyond the Ministry's reach. He could have lived as a fugitive, spending his days wondering if James and Lily might still be alive if he'd been faster, smarter, less trusting of a rat who'd been playing both sides for months. But that would have meant leaving Harry. The thought of James's son growing up with stories of his godfather, the murderer, the betrayer, the coward who'd run rather than face justice, that was worse than Azkaban. That was worse than dying. So he'd stayed. He'd confronted Peter on that London street, watched the bastard blow apart 12 innocent muggles and vanish into the sewers as a rat, leaving Sirius standing in the rubble with his wand in his hand and guilt written across his face. He'd let the auras arrest him. He'd endured 30 hours in a ministry holding cell, listening to Barty Crouch Sr. bark about expedited sentencing and the necessity of swift justice in wartime. And now he sat in chains before the full Wizengamot, every face in the tiered chamber, staring down at him with expressions ranging from disgust to pity to cold satisfaction. They'd already decided his guilt. This wasn't a trial. It was theatre. Sirius Orion Black, Barty Crouch Sr. intoned, from his position at the center of the prosecutor's bench, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You stand accused of the murders of James Charles Potter, Lily Evans Potter, and Peter Allen Pettigrew. You are further accused of the murders of 12 muggles in the explosion on Chestnut Street, and of providing information to the terrorist organization led by the dark wizard Tom Marvolo Riddle, also known as Voldemort. The chains around Sirius's wrists felt heavier with each accusation. His throat was raw from screaming the truth at stone-faced auras who'd already written their reports. His robes were torn and blood-stained from his desperate attempts to dig through the rubble where Peter had supposedly died, searching for any trace of the rat who'd destroyed everything. How do you answer these charges? Not guilty. The words came out hoarse, barely audible. Sirius cleared his throat and tried again, louder. Not guilty to every charge. A ripple of scoffs and murmurs passed through the chamber. Someone in the upper tiers called out, "Murderer!" before being shushed by an usher. Crouch's smile was thin and triumphant. The evidence against you is overwhelming, Mr. Black. You were the Potter's secret keeper under the Fidelius charm. Only you could have revealed their location to he who must not be named. When your co-conspirator Peter Pettigrew attempted to apprehend you for your crimes, you murdered him and 12 innocent bystanders to cover your escape. He gestured toward a table laden with evidence bags. We have witness testimonies, magical residue from your wand, and your own presence at the scene of the crime. I see no need to prolong these proceedings. The sentence for your crimes is life imprisonment in Azkaban, to begin immediately. No. The word rang through the chamber with more force than Sirius had intended. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Crouch's eyebrows rose in apparent amusement. I beg your pardon? Sirius struggled to his feet, chains clanking. His legs shook. 30 hours without food or sleep. 30 hours of grief and rage and terror. But he forced himself upright. I said no. I demand a proper trial. Mr. Black, this is a proper trial. You have been formally charged. You have entered your plea, and the evidence against you is conclusive. All that remains is sentencing. Bollocks! The crude word echoed through the formal chamber like a slap. Several Wizengamot members gasped. Sirius didn't care. He was beyond caring about propriety when his life and Harry's future hung in the balance. This isn't a trial. You haven't presented a single witness. You haven't allowed me to question your evidence. You haven't even offered me veritaserum to verify my testimony." Crouch's face darkened. "Mr. Black, you will conduct yourself with the dignity befitting these proceedings, or you will be held in contempt." "Dignity?" Sirius let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. "My best friends are dead. Their son is orphaned, and you want to send me to prison for crimes I didn't commit, without even pretending to care about the truth. Where's the dignity in that?" "The truth," Crouch said coldly, "is that you betrayed the people who trusted you most. The truth is that you sold them to the Dark Lord for promises of power and glory. The truth is—" "The truth," interrupted a sharp, authoritative voice from the senior members section, "is that Mr. Black has requested veritaserum, which is his right under the Wizengamot Charter of 1692. All eyes turned toward Augusta Longbottom, who sat rigid and imposing in her vulture-topped hat. Her face was stern, her voice clipped with barely controlled anger, though whether that anger was directed at Sirius or at the proceedings themselves was impossible to tell. Crouch's jaw tightened. "Madam Longbottom, while I appreciate your attention to historical precedent, the exigencies of wartime require—" "The exigencies of wartime," Augusta cut him off, "require that we not abandon the very principles we fight to defend. If we begin sentencing accused criminals without proper investigation, how do we differ from the Dark Lord's kangaroo courts?" Her gaze swept the chamber, lingering on faces Sirius recognized as old pure-blood families. "The charter is clear. Any accused wizard may request veritaserum during questioning, and that request may only be denied by majority vote of the full Wizengamot." Griselda Marchbanks, ancient and sharp-eyed, leaned forward in her seat. "I second Madam Longbottom's invocation of charter rights. The accused has made a formal request." "As do I," came another voice. Tiberius Ogden, his face grave. "If we abandon due process now, when do we reclaim it?" Crouch looked as though he'd bitten into something sour. "Very well. All those in favor of administering veritaserum to the accused." Hands rose throughout the chamber. Not a majority, but enough. Augusta's faction of traditionalists, a scattering of younger members who looked uncertain about the rushed proceedings, and surprisingly, several ministry employees who seemed to welcome the chance to build an airtight case. "Motion carries," the words came out through gritted teeth. "We will recess for 1 hour while the serum is prepared." Sirius sank back into his chair as the chamber erupted in conversation. His heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear his own thoughts. This was it, his one chance to prove his innocence. To save Harry from growing up believing his godfather was a murderer. An hour later, the veritaserum burned down his throat like liquid fire. The world took on a strange, crystalline clarity. Every detail seemed important. The way the light caught the brass fixtures, the sound of quills scratching on parchment, the smell of old wood and older magic. But none of it felt quite real anymore. Nothing felt real except the compulsion to speak truth. Only truth. Nothing but truth. Crouch approached the witness chair where Sirius now sat unchained, a vial of the empty truth serum glinting on the table beside him. "State your full name for the record." "Sirius Orion Black." The words came out clear and steady, without his permission. "Were you the secret keeper for James and Lily Potter under the Fidelius charm?" This was it, the question that would damn him or save him. "No." The chamber erupted. Shouts, gasps, the bang of the chief warlock's gavel demanding order. Crouch's face had gone white. "I said, were you the secret keeper for James and Lily Potter?" "No." Sirius felt the truth pour out of him like water from a broken dam. "We changed secret keepers at the last minute. I was supposed to be, but we thought it was too obvious. Everyone knew James and I were like brothers. We thought Voldemort would expect me to be the secret keeper, so we chose someone else. Someone nobody would suspect." "Who?" The question cracked like a whip. "Peter Pettigrew." The silence that followed was absolute. Then the chamber exploded into chaos, shouts, accusations, demands for order. Through it all, Sirius sat perfectly still, the truth serum compelling him to answer every question with devastating honesty. Peter Pettigrew was the secret keeper. Yes. And where is Mr. Pettigrew now? Alive, hiding as a rat. He's an illegal animagus. We all were, back at school. When I confronted him yesterday, he killed those muggles to fake his own death and escaped in his animal form. The Shamst too. Questions came faster now, Crouch's voice rising with each impossible answer. The story spilled out. Peter's growing fear as Voldemort's power increased, his secret meetings with Death Eaters, the way he'd started avoiding James and Lily in their final weeks. How Sirius had suspected something was wrong, but trusted his friends too much to voice his doubts. How he'd arrived at Godric's Hollow to find his best friends dead and their son alive by a miracle he still couldn't comprehend. You maintain that Peter Pettigrew is alive? Yes. That he was working for the Dark Lord? Yes. That he murdered the 12 muggles to fake his own death? Yes. And you had no part in the deaths of James and Lily Potter? None. Sirius's voice broke on the word. Even under Veritaserum, the grief was overwhelming. I loved them. They were my family. I would have died for them. I should have died for them. The chamber had fallen silent again, the weight of revealed truth settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Crouch stood frozen, his case crumbling around him. In the gallery, Sirius could see faces changing, expressions shifting from disgust to confusion to dawning horror at what had nearly happened. Chief Warlock Banald finally found her voice. Mr. Crouch, do you have any evidence to contradict the testimony given under Veritaserum? Crouch looked around desperately, as though evidence might materialize from thin air. The witness could be lying. Veritaserum isn't foolproof. Mr. Crouch, Banald's voice was ice-cold. Are you seriously suggesting that this man has managed to overcome Veritaserum? A feat accomplished by perhaps a dozen wizards in recorded history? The prosecutor's shoulders sagged. No, Chief Warlock. Then do you wish to withdraw the charges against Mr. Black? Another long pause. Yes. The Ministry withdraws all charges. The antidote to Veritaserum tasted like mint and made Sirius's head spin. As the compulsion to speak truth faded, other sensations rushed back. Relief so powerful it made him dizzy. Rage at how close he'd come to losing everything, and underneath it all, a growing realization of what this meant. He was free. He was innocent in the eyes of the law. But more importantly, there is one more matter to address, Chief Warlock Banald announced, as the chamber began to settle. The custody of Harry James Potter. Albus Dumbledore rose from his seat in the senior advisors section. He looked older than his 100 years, his usually twinkling eyes dim with what might have been regret. Chief Warlock, the boy has already been placed with his maternal relatives, as his parents wished. He is safe and cared for. Actually, Augusta Longbottom's voice cut through whatever Dumbledore had planned to say next. There is the matter of the godfather's rights. Mr. Black was legally appointed as young Harry's guardian in the event of his parents' deaths. That appointment was witnessed and magically binding. Dumbledore's blue eyes sharpened. Madam Longbottom, while Mr. Black's innocence is now clear, we must consider Harry's welfare. Mr. Black is a young man, unmarried, with no experience raising children. The Dursleys can provide stability, normalcy. The Dursleys, Sirius interrupted, finding his voice at last, hate magic. They hate everything Harry represents. You want to leave James and Lily's son with people who will teach him to be ashamed of what he is. Harry will be safer away from the wizarding world. There are still Death Eaters at large, still those who might seek to harm him for what he represents. With his aunt and uncle, with his godfather, Augusta Longbottom said firmly. who was chosen by his parents specifically for this purpose, who has been proven innocent of all charges, who has every legal right to claim custody. She turned to address the chamber. I call for a formal vote on the custody of Harry Potter. All in favor of upholding the Godfather's rights as established by James and Lily Potter? Hands rose throughout the chamber, more than had voted for Veritaserum, more than Sirius had dared hope. The traditionalists, the families who valued pure blood customs of guardianship and magical heritage, the younger members who'd been swayed by his testimony, even some of the ministry officials, perhaps unwilling to compound one injustice with another. Motion carries, Bagnold announced. Custody of Harry James Potter is hereby awarded to his lawful godfather, Sirius Orion Black, with all rights and responsibilities thereof. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder. Sirius Black was free, vindicated, and suddenly responsible for the most important child in the wizarding world. He put his head in his hands and wept. Chapter 2. Bringing Harry home. The house on Privet Drive looked exactly like every other house on Privet Drive. Beige brick, manicured lawn, and an air of aggressive normalcy that made Sirius's skin crawl. Number 4 sat squat and smug in the afternoon drizzle, its windows glowing yellow against the grey November sky, giving no indication that the most famous child in the wizarding world lived behind those perfectly ordinary walls. Sirius stood at the end of the drive, his hands shaking. Not from cold, though the November air bit through his hastily transfigured robes. Not from exhaustion, though he hadn't slept since James and Lily died. The trembling came from something deeper. The knowledge that in a few minutes he would hold James's son in his arms for the first time since that terrible Halloween night. You don't have to do this alone. Remus's voice was quiet, steady, the same tone he'd used to talk Sirius down from countless bad ideas during their Hogwarts years. Except this wasn't a bad idea. This was the most important thing Sirius would ever do. I know. Sirius glanced at his friend. Former friend, he supposed, given the 12 years of hatred that had stretched between them until yesterday's trial. Remus looked older than his 21 years, new lines etched around his amber eyes, his sandy hair already showing threads of premature silver. The war had aged them all, but grief had a way of accelerating the process. Thank you for coming with me, for believing me. I should have believed you from the start. Remus's jaw tightened. I should have known you'd never betray James and Lily. I should have demanded they give you a proper trial instead of accepting. Stop! Sirius's voice was firmer than he felt. We all believed Peter was harmless. We all trusted him. The only difference is that I'm the one who has to live with the consequences. That wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. Harry would live with the consequences too. Harry, who'd spent 4 days with relatives who hated magic, who hated everything he represented, who'd probably already started teaching him that being different was something to be ashamed of. 4 days. It could have been 11 years. Sirius straightened his shoulders and started up the drive. The doorbell chimed with aggressive cheerfulness, a peppy little tune that sounded like it had been designed to chase away anything interesting or unusual. Footsteps approached from inside, heavy and annoyed. The door swung open to reveal a man the approximate size and color of a boiled ham, his small eyes narrowing further when they took in Sirius's appearance. We're not buying anything, Vernon Dursley announced, already starting to close the door. I'm not selling anything. Sirius put his foot in the doorway before the door could close completely. I'm here for Harry. Vernon's face went from pink to purple in record time. Harry, who are you? How do you know about? I'm Sirius Black, Harry's godfather. The color drained from Vernon's face so quickly, Sirius thought the man might faint. Behind Vernon, a thin woman appeared. Lily's sister. though the resemblance was painful rather than comforting. Petunia Dursley looked like someone had taken all of Lily's warmth and brightness and replaced it with vinegar and disappointment. "You," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're one of them. One of those people." "I'm a wizard, yes." Sirius kept his voice level, professional. The Dursleys were clearly terrified, and while part of him wanted to enjoy their discomfort after what they'd put Harry through, losing his temper wouldn't help anyone. "And I have legal custody of Harry. I've come to take him home." Vernon sputtered, his moustache quivering with indignation. "Now see here, you can't just— We've been caring for the boy, feeding him, housing him, for 4 days. Sirius's voice sharpened despite his best efforts. 4 days, during which you've kept him in a cupboard and told him his parents died in a car crash. Petunia flinched. "How did you—" "Magic, Mrs. Dursley. It has a way of revealing the truth." Sirius looked past, them into the hallway, listening for any sound of a child. The house was eerily quiet. "Where is he?" "Upstairs," Petunia said quietly. "Sleeping. He's been difficult since he arrived, crying constantly. We thought perhaps if we gave him time to settle—" "You thought wrong." Remus stepped up beside Sirius, his presence a steadying force. "Mrs. Dursley, I'm Remus Lupin. We understand this situation has been difficult for everyone, but Harry belongs with people who can understand and nurture his magical nature." Vernon's face was rapidly approaching a shade that shouldn't occur in nature. "Magical nature? The boy's not even 2 years old. He doesn't have a magical anything. And we won't have any more freaks in this house, spreading their unnaturalness." The windows rattled, the porch light flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm started wailing. Sirius took a deep breath and forced his magic back under control. "Mr. Dursley, I've just spent 30 hours being accused of murdering my best friends. I've had exactly 3 hours of sleep in the past week, and I've discovered that the only family Harry has left considers him a burden to be hidden away. I am not in the mood for your prejudice." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Vernon took a step back, his face pale beneath the purple flush. "Vernon?" Petunia's voice was sharp, but when Sirius looked at her, he saw something unexpected in her eyes. Not fear, relief. "Get the boy. Petunia, get him." Her voice brook no argument. "Get his things, all of them." Vernon looked like he wanted to argue, but something in his wife's expression stopped him. He stomped up the stairs, his heavy footsteps echoing through the house. Petunia stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, not quite meeting Sirius's eyes. He's not like other children. Strange things happen around him. Toys moving when he's upset, lights flickering when he cries. We don't understand it. We can't," she trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Perhaps it's better this way. Perhaps he belongs with his own kind." Her own kind. As if Harry were some different species rather than a grieving toddler who'd lost everything. Before Sirius could respond, Vernon reappeared at the top of the stairs, carrying a small bundle of blankets that seemed impossibly tiny. Behind him came the soft sound of whimpering, not quite crying, but the quiet distress of a child who'd learned that making noise brought unwelcome attention. Sirius's heart clenched. Harry was awake then, had probably been awake the whole time, listening to the raised voices and wondering what new strangeness was about to disrupt his small world. Vernon descended the stairs with the careful movements of someone handling something fragile and unwanted. When he reached the bottom, he thrust the bundle toward Sirius without ceremony. "Here, take him, and don't come back." Sirius's hands shook as he accepted the weight of his godson. Harry was smaller than he'd expected, smaller than he'd seemed in the brief glimpses Sirius had caught during clandestine visits to Godric's Hollow. 15 months old and tiny for his age, with James's unruly black hair and Lily's vivid green eyes, eyes that looked up at Sirius with a mixture of curiosity and wariness that no child should possess. "Hello, Harry," Sirius whispered, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. "I'm Sirius. I'm going to take care of you now." Harry stared at him for a long moment, then turned his head to look at Remus. His small hand reached out, grasping at the air between them, and Remus moved closer without thinking. "Hello there," Remus said softly, offering Harry his finger to grasp. "I'm Remus. We're friends of your mummy and daddy." At the word mummy, Harry's face crumpled, and he let out a heartbroken wail that cut through Sirius like a knife. The sound was pure grief, the cry of a child who understood loss, even if he couldn't articulate it. The windows rattled again, and the hall light flickered in rhythm with Harry's sobs. "Make him stop that," Vernon hissed, looking around nervously at the dancing lights. "He's grieving," Sirius snapped, bouncing Harry gently in an attempt to soothe him. "His parents are dead. He's been taken from everything familiar and placed with strangers who treat him like a burden. Of course he's crying." Harry's wails intensified, and Sirius felt a moment of panic. How was he supposed to comfort a child? He'd never been around babies, had no idea what Harry needed or wanted or— "May I?" Remus's voice was calm, practiced. Before Sirius could respond, Remus was gently taking Harry from his arms, cradling the toddler against his chest with surprising competence. "Shh, little one. It's all right. We've got at you now." Something in Remus's voice, perhaps the quiet certainty, perhaps the genuine warmth, seemed to reach Harry. The wailing subsided to hiccups, then to sniffles. Harry pressed his face against Remus's shoulder, his small fists clutching at the fabric of his jumper. "Where did you learn to do that?" Sirius asked, awed. "Helped my mum with the neighbor children when I was younger," Remus said quietly, rubbing circles on Harry's back. "Before the bite. Before we had to move so often." The reminder of Remus's lycanthropy hit Sirius like a cold shock. How was that going to work? How were they going to manage Harry during the full moons? How were they going to explain? Later. Those were problems for later. Right now, Harry was quiet and safe, and that was what mattered. "His things?" Sirius turned back to the Dursleys, who were watching the magical light show with expressions of horror and disgust. Vernon disappeared again, returning with a small cardboard box that couldn't possibly contain more than a few items of clothing. When Sirius looked inside, his anger flared again. A handful of 2 small baby clothes, a worn blanket, and nothing else. No toys, no comfort items, no photographs of his parents. "This is everything?" "He didn't arrive with much," Petunia said defensively. "Just the clothes on his back and that blanket." That was probably true. Hagrid would have taken Harry directly from the ruins of Godric's Hollow to Privet Drive, with no thought for what a child might need beyond basic survival. But 4 days should have been long enough for the Dursleys to purchase at least a few necessities, unless they'd assumed Harry wouldn't be staying long. Sirius looked at Petunia one more time, searching for any trace of his best friend's wife in the pinched, bitter face. "Did Lily ever mean anything to you? Did you ever love her? Even a little?" Petunia's face went white. For a moment something flickered in her eyes, pain, perhaps, or regret. Then her expression hardened again. "She was my sister," she said finally, "but she chose her world over ours. She chose magic over family. And look where it got her." The casual cruelty of the words hit Sirius like a physical blow. Beside him, Remus made a soft sound of protest, his arms tightening protectively around Harry. "She chose love," Sirius said quietly. "She chose to stand up to evil, to protect innocent people, to fight for a better world. And she died saving her son, your nephew, from a monster who would have killed him without a second thought." Petunia looked away. "I don't want to hear this." "No," Sirius agreed. I don't suppose you do." He turned away from Privet Drive without another word, Remus falling into step beside him. They walked in silence until they reached the end of the street, where the neat suburban houses gave way to a small park. Only then did Sirius stop, his hands shaking again as the reality of what they'd just done hit him. Harry was theirs now. This small, grieving child was their responsibility, their family, their world. "Sirius." Remus's voice was gentle. "Are you all right?" "No." Sirius laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm 22 years old, Remus. I've never changed a nappy in my life. I don't know how to make baby food, or what time children are supposed to go to bed, or how to stop a 15-month-old from crying. And now I'm responsible for Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the most famous child in our world. And if I mess this up, if I fail him the way I failed James and Lily—" "You didn't fail James and Lily," Remus said firmly. "Peter failed them. Voldemort failed them. You tried to protect them, and when that wasn't enough, you came for their son. You fought for him in court, and you're taking him home to keep him safe. That's not failure, Sirius. That's love." Harry had fallen asleep in Remus's arms, his small face peaceful for the first time since they'd arrived. In sleep, he looked even younger, more vulnerable, and Sirius felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a cloak. "Grimold Place," Sirius said suddenly. "We'll have to make it safe for him. All those dark artifacts, the cursed objects, creatures probably polishing something that could kill a child just by looking at it wrong." "We'll figure it out," Remus said. "Together. You don't have to do this alone. Together." Sirius tested the word, found it strange after so many years of believing he'd lost everything that mattered. "You'll stay? Help me raise him? For as long as you'll have me?" Remus's smile was small but genuine. James and Lily would want Harry to grow up surrounded by love, not raised by one overwhelmed godfather stumbling through parenthood on his own. Sirius looked down at Harry's sleeping face, at the tiny hand curled against Remus's chest, at the peaceful expression that spoke of a child who finally felt safe. "All right then," he said softly. "Let's take our son home." Chapter 3. Learning to be a Family. 3 months of mornings at Grimold Place had taught Sirius that toddlers operated on a schedule designed by some particularly vindictive deity. Harry woke every day at precisely 6:30, regardless of how late he'd stayed up the night before, how many nightmares had interrupted his sleep, or how desperately his guardians needed just one more hour of rest. This particular February morning was no exception. Sirius jolted awake to the sound of Harry's voice echoing through the old house. Not crying, thankfully, but chattering to himself in that stream of consciousness way 18-month-olds had mastered. The words were mostly incomprehensible, but Sirius had learned to distinguish between Harry's happy babbling and his distressed calls for attention. This was happy babbling. Thank Merlin for small mercies. Sirius rolled out of bed, his body protesting the movement. 3 months of broken sleep, of learning to parent while grieving, of transforming a house full of dark artifacts into something resembling a home. It had taken a toll he hadn't expected. At 22, he should have felt invincible. Instead, he felt ancient. The hallway of Grimold Place looked different in the pale morning light. Gone were most of the cursed objects, the dark tapestries, the sense of malevolent watchfulness that had characterized his childhood home. In their place were child safety charms, colorful rugs that wouldn't curse small feet, and the general chaos that came with housing a magical toddler. Harry's room, formerly the second-best guest room, now painted a cheerful yellow, was at the end of the hall. Sirius could hear him clearly now, an animated conversation with someone or something that definitely wasn't there. "Mooney sleeping," Harry was saying, his voice serious and important. "Shh," Padfoot, wake up soon." Sirius's heart clenched. Those had been Harry's first real words. Not Mama or Dada, like other children, but Padfoot and Mooney, the nicknames his parents' best friends had carried since their school days. It should have been wonderful, a sign of how quickly Harry had bonded with them. Instead, it reminded Sirius daily of everything Harry had lost, everything he would never have. He pushed open the door to find Harry standing in his crib, still in his dragon print pajamas, talking earnestly to a stuffed stag that Andromeda had brought him the week before. The toy had been charmed to move its head occasionally, a simple bit of magic that delighted Harry endlessly. "Good morning, little man," Sirius said softly, not wanting to startle him. Harry's face lit up like someone had cast a Lumos charm behind his eyes. "Padfoot!" He reached up, making grabbing motions that had become heartbreakingly familiar. "Up, up!" Sirius lifted him from the crib, marveling as always at how solid Harry felt, how real. For the first month, he'd woken every morning convinced this was all a dream, that he'd open his eyes to find himself back in a ministry holding cell, waiting for the Dementors to come. But Harry's weight in his arms, the warmth of his small body, the way he immediately buried his face in Sirius's shoulder, that was real in a way nothing else had been since James and Lily died. "Where's Mooney?" Harry asked, looking around the room with the air of someone conducting a very important survey. "Uncle Mooney is sleeping," Sirius said, carrying Harry toward the kitchen. "He had a rough night." That was putting it mildly. Yesterday had been the full moon, and while Remus had a secure place to transform in the basement, extensively warded and reinforced, after a memorable incident involving Harry's accidental magic and a locked door, the aftermath was always difficult. Remus would sleep until noon if they were lucky, and when he woke, he'd be tired, sore, and consumed with guilt about the danger his condition posed to Harry. They'd had this argument a dozen times over the past 3 months. Remus insisted he should find somewhere else to stay during his transformations, that it wasn't safe to have a werewolf in the same house as a child. Sirius insisted that Harry needed stability, that Remus was family, that they'd made the basement as secure as Gringotts. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that he needed Remus there too, that the idea of facing Harry's nightmares and questions and endless energy alone was more terrifying than any werewolf could ever be. The kitchen at Grimold Place had undergone the most dramatic transformation of any room in the house. Gone was the formal dining setup that had characterized Sirius's childhood, replaced with a battered wooden table, mismatched chairs, and the comfortable chaos of a space actually meant for living. Harry's high chair sat beside the window, positioned to catch the morning light and give him a view of the small garden Remus had started behind the house. "Hungry," Harry announced as Sirius settled him into the chair. At 18 months, his vocabulary was expanding rapidly, another sign that the love and attention he received here was healing the damage done by his brief stay with the Dursleys. "What would you like?" Sirius asked, opening the cupboard to survey their options. "Porridge? Toast? Perhaps some nice liver and onions?" Harry giggled, a sound that never failed to make Sirius's chest feel warm and tight. "No liver. Yucky." "No liver," Sirius agreed solemnly. "I suppose porridge will have to do." As he prepared Harry's breakfast, Sirius found himself falling into the rhythm that had become second nature over the past few months. Harry chattered away, mixing real words with his own invented language, occasionally lapsing into what sounded like a conversation with invisible companions. The healers at St. Mungo's had assured Sirius that this was normal. Magical children often developed imaginary friends earlier than their Muggle counterparts, and given Harry's traumatic start in life, it was actually a healthy sign of recovery. Still, sometimes Sirius wondered if Harry's friends were entirely imaginary. More than once, he'd found toys moved to places Harry couldn't reach, or heard what sounded like adult voices when Harry was supposedly playing alone. The house was old, full of magic both benign and otherwise. Perhaps some echo of James and Lily lingered here, drawn by their son's presence. It was a comforting thought, even if it probably wasn't true. "Sirius, is everything all right?" He turned to find Andromeda Tonks standing in the kitchen doorway, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her arms full of what looked like children's books. She'd been coming by once or twice a week since Christmas, offering advice about child-rearing that Sirius desperately needed, providing a female presence in Harry's life that seemed increasingly important. "Andromeda!" Harry squealed, bouncing in his chair with excitement. "Dora, come!" "Not today, love," Andromeda said, settling the books on the counter and moving to ruffle Harry's hair. "Dora's at lessons, but she sent these for you." Nymphadora, who insisted everyone call her Tonks, even at 8 years old, had taken to Harry with the fierce protectiveness of an older sibling. She visited whenever Andromeda allowed it, teaching Harry games that usually ended in chaos, reading him stories with different voices for every character, and generally treating him like the little brother she'd never had. "You look tired," Andromeda observed, studying Sirius with the clinical eye of someone who'd raised a child on her own. "Full moon was last night," Sirius said quietly, glancing toward the ceiling as if he could see through to Remus's room. "Remus always has a rough time afterward. And you worry about him." It wasn't a question. Andromeda had figured out the dynamics of their household within her first visit, had accepted the presence of a werewolf with the same matter-of-fact practicality she brought to everything else. "How is Harry handling it?" "Better than I expected." Sirius spooned porridge into Harry's bowl, adding a dollop of honey that immediately captured the toddler's attention. "He knows Uncle Mooney gets sick sometimes, that he needs quiet and rest afterward. He's remarkably understanding for someone who's not even 2 yet. He's a remarkable child." Andromeda watched Harry attack his porridge with the single-minded determination of someone who viewed eating as a full-contact sport. "The books are about magical creatures, age-appropriate, of course. I thought it might help him understand that being different isn't something to fear." Sirius felt a flash of gratitude so intense it was almost painful. Andromeda had been disowned by the Black family for marrying a Muggle-born wizard, cast out just as thoroughly as Sirius had been for his political beliefs. But where Sirius had found a new family with James and the other marauders, Andromeda had been truly alone until Ted entered her life. She understood what it meant to lose everything, to build a family from scratch in a world that didn't always welcome your choices. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. I don't know what we'd do without—" The fireplace flared green, interrupting his words. A severe-looking woman in ministry robes stepped through, brushing ash from her sleeves with obvious distaste. "Mr. Black," she said crisply, "I am Dolores Umbridge from the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. I'm here for the monthly welfare check on Harry Potter." Sirius's jaw tightened. The welfare checks had started 6 weeks ago, prompted by what the ministry called concerns about the unconventional nature of the household. 2 unmarried men raising the boy who lived. Apparently this was cause for ongoing scrutiny, despite the fact that Sirius was Harry's legal guardian and Remus had been cleared by every background check they could devise. "Of course," Sirius said, his voice carefully neutral. "Harry's just finishing his breakfast." Umbridge's pale eyes swept the kitchen, taking in the cheerful chaos, the child-safe modifications, the evidence of a home where a toddler was loved and cared for. Her expression remained disapproving, as if she'd hoped to find something more scandalous than porridge and picture books. "Where is Mr. Lupin?" she asked, consulting a clipboard that had appeared from nowhere. "Sleeping," Sirius said shortly. "He's been unwell." "Ah, yes." Umbridge's smile was thin and unpleasant. "His monthly indisposition. Quite concerning, really, to have such an individual in close contact with a child. Have you considered alternative arrangements?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harry looked up from his porridge, sensing the tension even if he couldn't understand its source. "Uncle Mooney sick?" he asked, his voice small and worried. "Uncle Mooney is fine," Sirius said firmly, never taking his eyes off Umbridge. "He just needs rest. And Mr. Lupin is a registered werewolf with an exemplary record, fully compliant with all ministry regulations. His presence here has been approved by your department." "Approved, yes, but that doesn't mean it's wise." Umbridge made a note on her clipboard. "A child Harry's age is particularly vulnerable. One moment of lost control." "Would never happen," Andromeda interjected, her voice sharp with authority. "Remus Lupin is one of the most controlled, careful individuals I've ever met. Harry is safer with him than he would be with many fully human guardians." Umbridge's gaze shifted to Andromeda, her expression calculating. "And you are?" "Andromeda Tonks, Harry's cousin." The relationship was distant. Andromeda was Sirius's cousin, making her Harry's second cousin by adoption, but it was technically accurate. "I assist with his care when needed." More notes on the clipboard. Sirius was beginning to understand why criminals confessed to crimes they hadn't committed, anything to make that scratching sound stop. "Mr. Black," Umbridge said finally, "while the current arrangements appear adequate, the Ministry remains concerned about the long-term stability of this household. 2 young, unmarried men, one of them afflicted with lycanthropy, raising the most famous child in our world. Perhaps a more traditional family structure would be advisable. The Longbottoms, for instance, have expressed interest." "No." The word came out harder than Sirius had intended. The kitchen windows rattled slightly, and Harry's spoon rose 3 inches off the table before settling back down. "I am Harry's legal guardian," Sirius continued, his voice deadly quiet. "Appointed by his parents, confirmed by the Wizengamot, and recognized by every court in magical Britain. Unless you have evidence of abuse or neglect, which you don't, the Ministry has no authority to remove him from my care." Umbridge's smile became even more unpleasant. "Of course not, Mr. Black. We're simply monitoring the situation, ensuring the boy's welfare. I trust you understand." She made a few more notes, asked perfunctory questions about Harry's health and development, and finally stepped back into the fireplace with a swirl of green flames and ash. The silence that followed was deafening. "Nasty woman," Andromeda observed mildly. "Nasty," Harry agreed, apparently filing this new word away for future use. Sirius sank into his chair, suddenly exhausted. "They're looking for excuses. Any excuse to take him away." "Then we don't give them any," Andromeda said firmly. "Harry is healthy, happy, and clearly thriving. His magic is developing normally, his emotional bonds are strong, and he's showing no signs of trauma or distress. They can monitor all they like. There's nothing to find." Footsteps on the stairs interrupted her words. Remus appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled, his face pale but determined. He was wearing one of Sirius's old jumpers and a pair of pajama bottoms that had seen better days, but he'd clearly made an effort to look presentable. "Was that Umbridge I heard?" he asked quietly. "Monthly check," Sirius confirmed. "She's gone now." "Mooney!" Harry twisted in his chair, reaching toward Remus with obvious delight. "You awake?" "I'm awake, little wolf," Remus said, his voice soft with affection. He moved to Harry's chair, accepting the enthusiastic hug that was offered. "Did you miss me?" "Missed you lots," Harry said seriously. "Padfoot made porridge. No liver." "No liver." Remus raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. "How terribly disappointing." Harry giggled, and some of the tension left Sirius's shoulders. This was what mattered. Not Umbridge's disapproval, or the Ministry's concerns, or the whispered doubts of people who didn't understand what family meant. This was home. Chaotic, unconventional, built on friendship rather than blood, but home nonetheless. And no one was going to take it away from them. Chapter 4. The World Beyond the House. July 31st had always been a day of mixed emotions for Sirius Black. James Potter's birthday had been a celebration, a day of laughter and pranks and ridiculous amounts of cake. But July 31st was also the day that had changed everything, the day Harry Potter entered the world, bringing with him a prophecy and a target that would eventually cost his parents their lives. Now, watching Harry toddle around the transformed drawing room at Grimold Place, chasing soap bubbles that Remus had charmed to sing lullabies when popped, Sirius felt something he hadn't experienced in nearly a year. Pure, uncomplicated joy. "He's gotten so big," Augusta Longbottom observed from her seat by the window, her vulture-topped hat slightly askew from Harry's enthusiastic greeting. She held baby Neville in her lap, the round-faced boy barely a day younger than Harry, but significantly more sedate. "Hard to believe it's only been 8 months. 8 months since the trial. 8 months since Sirius had walked out of the Wizengamot chambers, a free man with custody of the most famous child in Wizarding Britain. It felt simultaneously like yesterday and like a lifetime. "Harry, careful with the—" Sirius started, but it was too late. Harry had grabbed onto one of the lower-hanging party streamers, and his excited tug brought down half the decorations in a cascade of silver and gold. Instead of crying or showing frustration, Harry clapped his hands in delight. "Pretty! Look, Padfoot, pretty!" "Very pretty," Sirius agreed, waving his wand to send the streamers floating back up to the ceiling. "But perhaps we should leave them up there for everyone to enjoy." Harry considered this with the serious expression of a 2-year-old weighing important matters. "Okay," he said finally, then immediately lost interest and toddled over to where Remus was setting up what looked suspiciously like a miniature obstacle course. "He's remarkably well adjusted," Augusta said, adjusting her grip on Neville, who was regarding the chaos with wide, solemn eyes, given everything he's been through. "Children are resilient," Remus offered, charming a small tunnel to expand and contract in a way that made Harry squeal with delight. "And he's been surrounded by love. That makes all the difference." It did make a difference, Sirius reflected. The terrified, withdrawn child they'd collected from Privet Drive had blossomed into this confident, curious toddler who approached the world with James's boldness and Lily's warmth. Harry still had nightmares sometimes, still called for his parents in his sleep, but those episodes were becoming less frequent. Most of the time, he was simply a normal 2-year-old, if any child raised in a house full of magic could be considered normal. The fireplace flared green, and Minerva McGonagall stepped through with her usual precise grace. She was dressed in emerald robes rather than her teaching attire, but her expression held the same sharp intelligence that had intimidated countless Hogwarts students. "Professor McGonagall!" Harry abandoned the obstacle course and ran toward her with arms outstretched. In the 8 months since his adoption, he'd developed an uncanny ability to sense which adults were trustworthy and which were not. McGonagall had apparently passed some internal test during her previous visits. "Hello, Harry," McGonagall said, her stern expression softening as she bent to scoop him up. "My, you've grown since I saw you last. Quite the young man now, aren't you?" "2," Harry announced proudly, holding up 2 fingers in a gesture that was almost correct. "Birthday." "Yes, it is your birthday, a very special day indeed." McGonagall carried him back toward the group, nodding to Augusta and offering Remus a warm smile before her gaze settled on Sirius. "Mr. Black, you're looking well." There was something in her tone that suggested this was not entirely a social visit. Sirius felt the familiar tension that came with any unexpected contact from the wizarding establishment, even from someone he trusted. "Professor," he said carefully, "thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you'd received the invitation." "Oh, I received it." McGonagall settled into the chair Remus quickly conjured for her, keeping Harry on her lap with practiced ease. though I confess this visit serves multiple purposes. The deputy headmistress of Hogwarts has certain obligations when it comes to monitoring the welfare of future students. More welfare checks. Sirius's voice came out sharper than he'd intended. Harry looked up at him with concern, picking up on the tension even if he didn't understand its source. Not the ministry variety, McGonagall said quickly. This is personal, Mr. Black. James and Lily were among my favorite students. Their son's happiness is important tool to me. The sincerity in her voice eased some of Sirius's defensive posture. McGonagall had been at James and Lily's wedding, had sent Christmas gifts during Harry's first year of life. Her concern was genuine, not bureaucratic. "And what's your assessment, Professor?" Remus asked quietly. McGonagall looked around the room, at the cheerful chaos of birthday decorations, at Harry's comfortable interaction with the adults present, at the obvious care that had gone into creating a child-friendly space in what had once been the formal drawing room of one of the darkest houses in magical Britain. "My assessment," she said finally, "is that Harry Potter is exactly where he belongs." The fireplace flared again, and this time a whole family tumbled through in a tangle of red hair and excited chatter. Arthur Weasley emerged first, brushing ash from his robes and grinning apologetically, followed by his wife Molly, and what appeared to be most of their children. "Sorry we're late," Arthur called out, his enthusiasm filling the room. "Had a bit of a situation with a muggle telephone that someone had cursed to speak only in limericks. Fascinating bit of magic, actually, though not terribly practical for—" "Arthur," Molly interrupted firmly. "Introductions first, shop talk later." Harry had gone very still in McGonagall's arms, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of new people. The Weasleys represented the largest group of strangers he'd encountered since coming to live at Grimmauld Place, and Sirius could see him retreating into the shyness that still surfaced when he felt uncertain. "Harry," Sirius said gently, moving closer. "These are our friends. The Ulathel. Weasleys. They have children, too. Would you like to meet them?" Two identical red-haired boys, perhaps 4 years old, had already spotted the obstacle course Remus had created and were eyeing it with obvious interest. "Is that a tunnel that moves?" one of them asked. "Can we try it?" asked the other. "Fred, George, manners," Molly scolded, though her smile took the sting out of the words. She turned to Sirius with the warm expression of someone who had decided to like you before you'd even met. "Mr. Black, thank you so much for inviting us. Arthur's been wanting to meet you properly ever since the trial. The ward work you've done here is extraordinary," Arthur added, his eyes bright with professional curiosity. "The integration of Muggle safety concepts with traditional magical protections. I've never seen anything like it. How did you manage to make the electrical systems compatible with the magical field density?" "Arthur," Molly warned again. "It's all right," Sirius said, amused despite himself. "I'm happy to discuss it later. Right now, though, I think some young guests are more interested in birthday cake than ward theory." The twins, Fred and George, if Sirius had caught the names correctly, had indeed been distracted by the promise of cake. But it was the smallest Weasley, a boy about Harry's age with the characteristic red hair and a face full of freckles, who caught Harry's attention. "That's Ron," Molly explained, noticing Harry's interest. "He's just turned 2 as well. Perhaps they'll be friends." Ron was clinging to his mother's robes, just as shy as Harry, but clearly curious about the other toddler. For a moment, the two boys simply stared at each other with the solemn intensity that small children brought to important first meetings. Then Harry wiggled down from McGonagall's lap and toddled over to Ron, offering him one of his favorite toys, a small wooden dragon that Andromeda had given him. "Share," Harry said seriously, pressing the toy into Ron's hands. Ron's face lit up with delight, and he immediately sat down on the floor to examine this new treasure. Harry plopped down beside him, and within minutes they were babbling at each other in the incomprehensible language that seemed to be universal among toddlers. "Well," Arthur said, grinning, "that was easier than expected." The afternoon passed in a blur of controlled chaos. The older Weasley children, Bill, Charlie, and Percy, were polite and well-behaved, though clearly fascinated by the house and its magical modifications. The twins were energetic, requiring constant supervision to prevent them from dismantling anything important. And the youngest members of both families seemed perfectly content to share toys and explore the child-safe areas Sirius and Remus had so carefully prepared. "It's good for him," McGonagall observed quietly, watching Harry show Neville how to make the charmed flowers in the window box change colors. "He needs to know there are others like him. Children who understand magic as something natural and wonderful, not something to be hidden or ashamed of." Sirius nodded, thinking of the Dursleys and their determined campaign to crush everything magical out of Harry's world. He'll start more formal socialization soon. Remus has found a group of magical families who meet regularly for educational activities. "Excellent," McGonagall approved. "And his magical development?" "Strong," Remus answered, joining their quiet conversation. "Very strong. Yesterday he made every flower in the garden bloom simultaneously because he was excited about his birthday. The control will come with age and training. But the power—" He trailed off, glancing around to make sure Harry wasn't listening. "The power is remarkable." McGonagall looked thoughtful. His parents both showed exceptional magical ability from an early age. I'm not surprised he's inherited that talent. You'll want to start him on basic theory soon. Not spells, of course, but concepts. Understanding what magic is and how it works. It will help him develop better control. "We've already begun," Sirius said. "Simple things. The difference between accidental magic and intentional magic. Why we use wands. Why some magic requires careful thought and others respond to emotion. 2 years old seems young for such concepts." "Harry isn't a typical 2-year-old, Remus pointed out. "His vocabulary is already well beyond his age group, and his comprehension—" He gestured toward the corner where Harry was carefully explaining to Ron why the toy dragon only breathed fire when you asked it nicely. "He understands more than most children twice his age." McGonagall watched Harry for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "His parents would be proud," she said finally. "James always said his son would be extraordinary. I don't think even he could have predicted how right he was." The party wound down as the sun began to set, families departing through the fireplace with promises to visit again soon. Ron had to be gently separated from the wooden dragon, which Harry ultimately decided to let him keep as a birthday gift to himself, a gesture that made Molly Weasley look suspiciously teary-eyed. Augusta was the last to leave, settling Neville more securely in her arms as she prepared to step into the green flames. "The same time next month?" she asked, referring to their standing arrangement for Harry and Neville to play together. "Of course," Sirius confirmed. "Thank you for coming. For everything." Augusta nodded briskly, but her expression was warm. "That boy is lucky to have you, Sirius Black. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." After she disappeared into the flames, the house fell quiet except for the sound of Harry's chatter as Remus got him ready for bed. Sirius began cleaning up the party debris with lazy waves of his wand, feeling pleasantly exhausted in the way that came from a day well spent. "Padfoot!" Harry called from the top of the stairs, his voice sleepy but insistent. "Yes, little man." "Good birthday." Sirius smiled, vanishing the last of the streamers and heading upstairs to help with bedtime stories. "The best birthday," he agreed. And for the first time since James and Lily died, he truly meant it. Chapter 5. Shadows of the Past. The letter arrived with the morning post on July the 28th, 3 days before Harry's 3rd birthday. Sirius might have missed it entirely, mixed as it was among the usual collection of birthday party RSVPs and ministry correspondence, if not for the way his hands began shaking the moment he touched the parchment. Dark magic. Not a curse exactly, but something designed to unsettle, to remind him that not everyone in the wizarding world was pleased with his freedom or his choices. "What is it?" Remus asked quietly, glancing up from where he sat helping Harry practice writing his letters at the kitchen table. Sirius turned the envelope over in his hands, noting the absence of a return address, the expensive parchment that suggested old money and older prejudices. "Fan mail," he said dryly, but his attempt at humor fell flat. Harry looked up from his parchment, his green eyes, so much like lilies, wide with curiosity. "What's fan mail, Padfoot?" "Letters from people who like you," Remus answered, before Sirius could figure out how to explain anonymous threats to a 3-year-old. "Like when Grandmamma Augusta sends you letters telling you how proud she is." That seemed to satisfy Harry, who returned to his careful attempts at drawing the letter H. His tongue stuck out slightly in concentration, and Sirius felt the familiar surge of protectiveness that came with watching Harry navigate the world with such innocent trust. The letter could wait. Whatever poison it contained, whatever threats or slurs or reminders of his family's expectations it held, it could wait until Harry wasn't watching. But the waiting made it worse. As the morning progressed, through Harry's breakfast, his attempt to help Remus in the garden, his enthusiastic destruction of what had been a perfectly organized toy chest, the letter seemed to burn against Sirius's consciousness. By the time Harry went down for his afternoon nap, Sirius felt as though he might crawl out of his skin if he didn't read the damned thing. He retreated to the study, warded the door against interruption, and broke the expensive wax seal. "Sirius Orion Black, your betrayal of everything the House of Black represents cannot be forgiven or forgotten. The blood traitor Potter and his mud-blood wife are dead, as they deserved to be, but their spawn lives on, to pollute the world with his presence. You have chosen to align yourself with the forces that seek to destroy our way of life. The Dark Lord may be gone, but his ideals live on. There are those among us who remember what you have done, who will not forget your crimes against pure blood society. The boy you protect is a symbol of everything weak and corrupt in our world. His existence is an insult to the memories of those who died fighting for our cause. You cannot protect him forever. One day, when the trials are over and the cowards in the ministry turn their attention elsewhere, we will find you. We will find him. And we will finish what the Dark Lord started. For the greater good." Sirius read the letter 3 times, each reading making his hands shake more violently than the last. The parchment began to smoke where his magic was unconsciously heating it, and he had to force himself to release it before it caught fire entirely. For the greater good. Grindelwald's motto, adopted by the worst elements of Voldemort's followers. The ones who saw the Dark Lord's defeat not as an ending, but as a temporary setback. "Sirius?" Remus's voice came from outside the study door, concerned but respectful of the privacy wards. "Everything all right?" Sirius vanished the letter with a sharp flick of his wand and opened the door. Remus took one look at his face and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. What did it say? Threats against Harry, against us. The usual pure-blood supremacist rhetoric about blood traitors, and Sirius's voice caught on the slur the letter had used for Lily. Even 2 years after her death, he couldn't bear to repeat it. How specific were the threats? Trust Remus, to cut straight to the tactical implications. Vague enough to avoid ministry action, specific enough to be unsettling. They know where we live. They know Harry's routine. Remus was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the careful analysis he'd learned during his brief time as an unofficial Order intelligence gatherer. We should increase the ward's strength around the house, add some detection charms for anonymous mail, perhaps contact a few auras we trust. No auras. Sirius's response was immediate and sharp. The moment we involve official channels, this becomes public. Harry's birthday party becomes a security risk assessment. Every child we invite becomes a potential target. Then what do you suggest? Sirius stared out the window toward the small garden where Harry would be playing in an hour once his nap ended. The boy who'd been targeted for death before he could walk, who'd survived the killing curse and carried its scar as a reminder of everything he'd lost, deserved better than a childhood lived in fear. We increase security quietly, ward upgrades, yes, but nothing visible to Harry or his friends. And Sirius hesitated, then forged ahead with a decision he'd been avoiding for months. We tell him, age appropriately, but we tell him about his parents, about what really happened to them. Sirius, he's 3. He's 3, and he's already asking questions we can't answer much longer. Why he doesn't have a mummy and daddy like other children. Why people stare at him when we go to Diagon Alley. Why there are pictures of him in shop windows that he doesn't remember posing for. Sirius turned away from the window to face his friend. He's going to start remembering things soon, Remus. Fragments of that night. The green light, the screaming. Wouldn't you rather he heard the truth from us first? Remus looked as though he wanted to argue, but something in Sirius's expression stopped him. What are you thinking? A story. Nothing graphic. Nothing that will give him nightmares worse than the ones he already has. But something that explains why his parents were heroes. Why they died protecting him. Why he's safe now with people who love him. They spent the next hour crafting a narrative that balanced truth with age-appropriate language, practicing the words until they felt natural rather than rehearsed. By the time Harry woke from his nap, pink-cheeked and tousled, they were as ready as they'd ever be. "Padfoot! Mooney!" Harry bounced down the stairs with the energy of someone who'd been unconscious for 2 hours and was ready to take on the world. "Can we visit the Pixies?" The Pixies were a recent addition to their household, a small colony that had taken up residence in the garden shed after Harry had accidentally created what Remus termed a magical resonance event while helping with the gardening. Instead of exterminating them, they'd decided to let Harry observe and interact with them under supervision. The results had been illuminating. "In a little while," Sirius said, settling into one of the low chairs they'd added to the sitting room for just this sort of conversation. "First, Remus and I wanted to talk to you about something important." Harry's face immediately grew serious. At 3, he was already remarkably good at reading the emotional temperature of a room, a skill that both impressed and worried Sirius in equal measure. "Am I in trouble?" "No, little man, you're not in trouble. But you've been asking questions about your mummy and daddy, and we think you're old enough now to hear some answers." Harry climbed into Remus's lap without being asked, settling himself comfortably against his uncle's chest. "Tell me about them." "Your mummy and daddy were very brave people," Remus began, his voice gentle but steady. "They lived during a time when there was a very bad wizard who wanted to hurt people who were different from him. People who weren't pure-blood wizards. People who believed that all kinds of people, muggle-born, half-blood, pure-blood, should be friends and work together." "Like us?" Harry asked, his small hand reaching out to grab Sirius's finger. "Exactly like us. Your daddy was pure blood like Padfoot, but he fell in love with your mummy, who was muggle-born like some of our friends. The bad wizard didn't like that. He didn't like that your parents were fighting against him, trying to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." Harry was listening with the intense focus he brought to his favorite stories, but his grip on Sirius's finger had tightened. "What happened to the bad wizard?" This was the part they'd practiced most carefully. "He tried to hurt your family," Sirius said quietly. "Your mummy and daddy fought very hard to protect you, and their love for you was so strong that it defeated the bad wizard. But they got hurt very badly, so badly that they couldn't get better. They died," Harry said matter-of-factly, and Sirius's heart broke a little at how easily he accepted this fundamental truth. Yes, they died, but because they loved you so much, because they protected you, you were safe. The bad wizard couldn't hurt you, and he went away. Will he come back? The question Sirius had been dreading. We don't think so, he said carefully. But even if he did, you have lots of people who love you and will always keep you safe. Remus and I, Andromeda and Tonks, the Weasleys, Grandmama Augusta. You have a whole family now, Harry. People who will never let anything bad happen to you. Harry considered this with the gravity of someone weighing serious matters. Can I see the pixies now? And just like that, the conversation was over. Harry wiggled down from Remus's lap and headed toward the garden door, apparently satisfied with the explanation they'd given him. Sirius and Remus exchanged glances over his head. Relief mixed with the knowledge that this was only the first of many such conversations they'd need to have. The pixies, as it turned out, were in high form that afternoon. They'd been rearranging the garden shed according to some incomprehensible system that involved sorting screws by color and building tiny furniture out of twigs and moss. Harry sat cross-legged on the shed floor, watching them work with the same fascination other children reserved for puppet shows. They're singing, he announced suddenly. Sirius tilted his head, listening. The pixies were indeed making noise, a high-pitched chittering that most people found intensely annoying. But as he focused on it, concentrating the way Harry seemed to do naturally, he began to hear patterns in the sound. Melody, rhythm, something that could, generously, be called singing. How do you do that? Remus asked quietly. Harry looked up at him with surprise. Do what? Understand them. The pixies. Most people can't tell what they're saying. They're not saying things, Harry said, as though this were obvious. They're feeling things. Happy feelings. About their new house and the pretty flowers and... He paused, his face scrunching up in concentration. And about the magic person who helped them feel safe. The magic person. Sirius felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Harry wasn't just hearing the pixies sing. He was sensing their emotions, understanding their reaction to his own magical signature. This was not normal 3-year-old behavior, even for a magical child. That evening, after Harry had been read his stories and tucked into bed, after the house wards had been quietly strengthened and new detection charms had been layered around the property, Sirius found himself standing in the study where he'd read the threatening letter earlier that day. Andromeda Tonks sat in the chair across from his desk, her dark hair pulled back severely, her expression thoughtful as she reviewed the security modifications he'd described. Your assessment? Sirius asked. Adequate for now, but we should consider more proactive measures. Andromeda had spent the past 2 years quietly researching protective magic, driven by her own fears for Tonks's safety in a world that still harbored Death Eater sympathizers. The letter suggests they're watching, learning your routines. Perhaps it's time to vary them more significantly. And Harry's development? Remarkable. Potentially concerning. Andromeda set down the notes she'd been reviewing and fixed Sirius with a steady gaze. Emotional resonance with magical creatures isn't unheard of, but at his age, with his level of sensitivity, it suggests his magical development is accelerating beyond normal parameters. Is that dangerous? Not dangerous exactly, but it makes him more visible to those who know what to look for. His magical signature is already distinctive, the boy who lived, the child who suffered the killing curse, adding unusual talents to that. She shrugged. It makes him more of a target, but also more capable of protecting himself as he grows. Sirius nodded slowly. Everything came back to the same fundamental truth. Harry would never be a normal child, never have a normal life. The best they could do was give him the tools and knowledge he'd need to navigate the extraordinary circumstances of his existence. There's something else, Andromeda said quietly. Something I wanted to discuss with you about the Black family legacy. What about it? Not the dark parts. Those are best left buried. But there are traditions, histories, forms of magic that could benefit Harry. The Black family may have fallen into darkness in recent generations, but it wasn't always so. We were once known for protective magic, for household wards, for the kind of defensive spells that kept our families safe through centuries of conflict. Sirius felt a spark of interest despite himself. You're suggesting I teach him Black family magic? I'm suggesting you give him every advantage you can. The blood protection your mother used when she died for him won't last forever, but the knowledge of how to weave protection into the very stones of a house, how to create sanctuary spaces that respond to family magic, those skills could save his life one day. It was a seductive thought, turning the dark legacy of his family into something that could protect rather than corrupt, using the very traditions his parents had tried to beat into him as weapons against those who would hurt the child he'd sworn to protect. "When do we start?" Sirius asked. Andromeda smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all evening. "Tomorrow. There's no time like the present to begin reclaiming our heritage for better purposes." Outside, the strengthened wards hummed with protective magic, and somewhere in the darkness, 3-year-old Harry Potter slept peacefully in his bed, protected by love and friendship and the growing determination of those who'd chosen to stand between him and the shadows of the past that still reached toward him. The threats were real. The dangers were genuine. But so was their resolve to meet them, and so was the extraordinary child at the center of it all, who would grow up knowing he was loved, protected, and surrounded by people who'd die before they let harm come to him. It would have to be enough. Chapter 6. First Steps into Learning. The Rosewood Academy for Young Witches and Wizards occupied a charming Victorian house in a quiet corner of Diagon Alley, its cheerful yellow paint and flower-filled window boxes giving no indication that it catered to children who could accidentally levitate their breakfast or turn their teddy bears purple when upset. Sirius had walked past the building dozens of times over the years without giving it a second thought. Now, standing before its cheerful red front door, with Harry's small hand tucked firmly in his own, he felt as nervous as if he were sending his godson off to face a dragon. "Are you ready, little man?" Isu asked, crouching down to Harry's level. Harry nodded solemnly, his green eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. At 3 years and 1 month, he was small for his age, but possessed of a quiet confidence that made him seem older than his years. The confidence wavered slightly now, faced with the prospect of spending several hours away from the safety of Grimold Place and the familiar presence of his guardians. "Will Uncle Mooney be here?" Harry asked for the 3rd time that morning. "Uncle Mooney will be helping teach," Sirius confirmed, smoothing down Harry's unruly hair in a futile gesture that James had performed countless times. "And you'll make new friends. Remember how much fun you had playing with Neville at your birthday party?" "Neville's nice," Harry agreed, but his grip on Sirius's hand tightened slightly. "What if the other children don't like me?" The question hit Sirius like a physical blow. How could he explain to a 3-year-old that some people might not like him simply because of who he was, because of the scar on his forehead and the fame that came with it? How could he prepare Harry for a world that would always see him as the boy who lived first and a child second? "They'll like you," Sirius said simply. "You're kind and funny and clever. What's not to like?" The front door opened before Harry could respond, revealing Remus dressed in comfortable teaching robes and wearing the patient smile that had made him every Hogwarts student's favorite substitute instructor. "Good morning, Harry," Remus said warmly. "Are you ready for your first day of learning?" Harry's face lit up at the sight of his uncle, and he released Sirius's hand to run toward Remus with arms outstretched. "Uncle Mooney, is it time for school?" "It is indeed." Remus scooped Harry up in a quick hug before setting him down again. Come on, let's go meet your classmates." The interior of Rosewood Academy was even more charming than its exterior suggested. The entrance hall had been painted in soft pastels, with child-height coat hooks along one wall and a bulletin board covered in colorful artwork that moved gently when viewed from the corner of one's eye. Through an open doorway, Sirius could hear the sound of children's laughter mixed with an adult voice reading what sounded like a story about a particularly mischievous house elf. "How many children?" Sirius asked quietly as they followed Remus down the cheerfully decorated hallway. 8 in total today, all between 3 and 4 years old, all from magical families who want their children to have some early socialization before they're old enough for formal education. Remus paused outside a door marked with a painted rainbow. "Mrs. Clearwater runs the program. She's been working with magical children for over 20 years. She knows about Harry's circumstances, but she's agreed to treat him just like any other student." That was more reassurance than Sirius had dared hope for. Since the threatening letter 2 months ago, he'd been hyper-aware of how many people knew Harry's daily routine, how many potential vulnerabilities existed in their carefully constructed life. The decision to enroll Harry in even this limited educational program had required weeks of security reviews and background checks that would have impressed the Department of Mysteries. The rainbow door opened to reveal a large, sunny room filled with child-sized furniture, colorful rugs, and enough toys to stock a small shop. 7 children were scattered around the space, some playing quietly, others engaged in what appeared to be an intense negotiation over a toy dragon that kept changing colors. "Children," called a warm voice from the far corner of the room, "we have a new friend joining us today." Mrs. Clearwater was exactly what Sirius had hoped for in an early childhood educator, middle-aged, comfortably maternal, and possessed of the sort of unflappable calm that suggested she'd seen everything magical children could dish out and remained undaunted. She approached them with a welcoming smile, her attention focused entirely on Harry, rather than on his famous scar. "You must be Harry," she said, crouching down to his level with the same instinctive respect for child psychology that Remus employed. "I'm Mrs. Clearwater. We're very excited to have you join our little group." Harry pressed closer to Sirius's leg, suddenly shy in the face of so much newness. Around the room, the other children had begun to take notice of the newcomer, their chatter dying down as they studied him with the frank curiosity of 3-year-olds. "That's Harry Potter," announced a small girl with long blonde hair, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "He's famous." "Hannah," Mrs. Clearwater said gently but firmly, "we don't talk about people being famous here. Harry is just Harry, the same way you're just Hannah." But the damage was done. 7 pairs of eyes were now fixed on Harry with varying degrees of interest, awe, and in one case, what might have been suspicion. Sirius felt his protective instincts flare, but before he could say anything, a familiar voice piped up from the corner where the toy dragon was still changing colors. "Harry!" Neville Longbottom abandoned the dragon entirely and toddled across the room with the determined gait of someone on a mission. "You came to school too!" The tension in the room dissolved as Harry's face brightened with recognition and relief. "Neville! Look, there are lots of toys!" And just like that, Harry was drawn into the social orbit of 3-year-old society. Neville proudly showed him the color-changing dragon, which immediately turned a brilliant shade of green when Harry touched it. The blonde girl, Hannah, approached more cautiously, but with obvious interest. A red-haired boy, who looked suspiciously like a Weasley cousin, offered to share his toy broomstick, which hovered a few inches off the ground. "He'll be fine," Mrs. Clearwater said quietly to Sirius, who was still hovering in the doorway like an overprotective mother hen. "This is always the hardest part for parents, but children adapt much faster than adults give them credit for." Sirius watched as Harry was introduced to Susan Bones, a serious-faced little girl who immediately began questioning him about whether he could really make magic happen without meaning to. The conversation was conducted with the grave importance that 3-year-olds brought to all significant matters. "I made all the flowers bloom at once when I was happy about my birthday," Harry confided, clearly proud of this accomplishment. "I made my Grand's tea set float when I was angry about having to take a nap," Susan replied, not to be outdone. "Children," Mrs. Clearwater called out cheerfully, "let's gather on the story carpet. It's time to start our day." The transition was remarkably smooth. 8 small children arranged themselves in a rough circle on a large, soft rug, decorated with moving illustrations from magical children's books. Harry ended up between Neville and Susan, with Hannah Abbott directly across from him. The blonde girl was still studying him with obvious fascination, but her expression had shifted from awe to simple curiosity. "Today we're going to read about Beatrice the Brave," Mrs. Clearwater announced, settling into a low chair with a picture book, whose cover showed a young witch facing down what appeared to be a rather large, grumpy-looking troll. "But first, let's talk about what makes someone brave. Harry, would you like to share something brave you've done?" Sirius tensed. The question seemed innocent enough, but Harry's life had been filled with the sort of experiences that would be impossible to explain to other 3-year-olds. How do you tell a group of toddlers that the bravest thing you've done is survive a killing curse? But Harry, bless him, thought for a moment, and then said seriously, "I helped Uncle Mooney when he was sick, even though he looked different and scary. Padfoot said being brave means helping people you love, even when you're frightened." "That's a wonderful example," Mrs. Clearwater said warmly. "Susan, what about you?" The morning continued with the gentle rhythm of early childhood education, story time followed by free play, a simple art project that involved magical paints that changed color based on the artist's mood, and a snack time that required careful monitoring to ensure no one accidentally transfigured their biscuits into anything unpalatable. Sirius watched through the large windows that looked out onto a small enclosed garden where the children had been taken to help with some very forgiving magical plants. Harry was absorbed in conversation with a dark-haired boy named Marcus while they watered pixie blossoms that giggled when splashed. "He's remarkably well adjusted," Remus observed, joining Sirius by the window. "I wasn't sure how he'd handle being around other children his age for extended periods." "He's been isolated too much," Sirius replied, watching Harry laugh at something Marcus had said. "We've been so focused on keeping him safe that we've forgotten he needs this. Needs to be a normal child with normal friendships. Look at how he's interacting with Susan," Remus pointed out. "She's clearly the leader of that little group, but Harry's not intimidated by her. He's holding his own in whatever negotiation they're having about those flowers." Indeed, Harry and Susan appeared to be engaged in serious discussion about the proper care of the pixie blossoms. Susan was gesticulating emphatically, while Harry listened with the patient attention of someone genuinely interested in what was being said. When she finished, Harry offered his own observations, pointing to different parts of the plant and demonstrating something with his hands. "Natural leadership," Mrs. Clearwater said, appearing beside them with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to supervising active children while maintaining adult conversations. "He doesn't dominate, but he doesn't follow blindly either. Very healthy social instincts." "How is he academically?" Sirius asked, though Harry hadn't been in class long enough for any real assessment. "Remarkable," Mrs. Clearwater said without hesitation. "His vocabulary is well above average for his age group. His comprehension is exceptional, and his attention span—" She gestured toward the garden where Harry was now explaining something to Neville with the patience of a born teacher. "Most 3-year-olds can focus on a single activity for perhaps 10 or 15 minutes. Harry's been engaged with those plants for nearly half an hour." "Remus has been working with him at home," Sirius said, not without pride. "Reading, basic concepts, simple problem-solving exercises. It shows. But more than that, he has intellectual curiosity. He asks why and how, rather than just accepting what he's told. That's going to serve him well as he grows older. The garden session ended with Mrs. Clearwater gathering the children for one final activity before pickup time. They were to draw pictures of their families using ordinary crayons that had been charmed to add subtle magical effects to the artwork. Sirius watched Harry consider his blank piece of paper with the same serious concentration he brought to all important decisions. Around him, the other children had begun drawing with varying degrees of artistic skill and enthusiasm. Neville was carefully creating what appeared to be his grandmother Augusta, complete with her distinctive hat. Susan was drawing a large group that probably represented the extended Bones family. Hannah's picture seemed to feature a house with an unusually tall chimney and what might have been a garden gnome. Harry's drawing began simply, 2 tall figures and 1 small one, rendered in the stick figure style, universal among young artists. But as he worked, adding details and colors, the picture began to take on a complexity that made Sirius's chest tight with emotion. The tall figures were clearly meant to be Sirius and Remus, one with black hair and the other with light brown. But around the edges of the paper, Harry had added other figures, a woman with long red hair and a man with messy black hair and glasses. They were smaller than the central figures, drawn more lightly, but they were definitely there. At the bottom of the paper, in the careful block letters Remus had taught him, Harry had written, "My family." When pickup time arrived, Harry ran to Sirius with his artwork clutched in his small hands, his face bright with excitement about everything he'd learned and done. "Look, Padfoot, I drew all of us." Sirius knelt to examine the drawing properly, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't name. "It's beautiful, Harry. Tell me about it." "That's you and Uncle Mooney," Harry explained, pointing to the central figures. "And that's Mummy and Daddy. Mrs. Clearwater said family can be anyone who loves you, so I put everyone in." Behind them, Mrs. Clearwater was speaking quietly to the other parents, providing updates on their children's first day. But Sirius barely heard her words over the sound of his own heartbeat and Harry's continued explanation of his artwork. "Neville said his mummy and daddy are in a special hospital and can't come home yet. But they're still his family. And Susan said her mummy died, but her Aunt Amelia takes care of her now. So I told them about how my mummy and daddy died, but you and Uncle Mooney take care of me." The casual way Harry discussed such heavy topics was both heartbreaking and oddly reassuring. He'd processed his circumstances with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to even the most difficult realities. More importantly, he'd found ways to connect with his classmates through shared experiences of loss and alternative family structures. "Did you have fun today?" Sirius asked as they prepared to leave. "Yes." Harry's enthusiasm was infectious. "Susan knows about lots of different magical plants, and Neville let me help with the dragon, and Hannah showed me how to make the paints change colors faster, and Marcus knows all the best places to find interesting beetles in his garden." As they walked home through the busy streets of Diagon Alley, Harry chatted about his new friends and everything he'd learned. Sirius listened with half his attention, while the other half processed what he'd observed during the morning. Harry was going to be fine. More than fine. He was going to thrive. The social skills, the intellectual curiosity, the emotional resilience they'd worked so hard to nurture were all there, all developing exactly as they should be. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Sirius allowed himself to believe that they were doing something right. That evening, after Harry had been fed dinner, bathed, and read his bedtime stories, Sirius found himself standing in the nursery doorway, watching his godson sleep. Harry's family drawing was tacked to the wall beside his bed, the magical crayons still adding subtle sparkles and gentle movements to the figures. Tomorrow there would be another day of learning, another opportunity for Harry to grow and develop and become the remarkable person Sirius was beginning to see glimpses of. There would be challenges ahead, certainly. Questions about his fame, about his scar, about the unusual circumstances of his upbringing. But there would also be friends like Susan and Neville, teachers like Mrs. Clearwater and Remus, and a foundation of love and security that would see him through whatever came next. It was, Sirius thought as he quietly closed the nursery door, exactly what James and Lily would have wanted for their son. Chapter 7. Growing into Magic. The first sign that Harry's 4th birthday was going to be different from his previous ones came at 6:30 in the morning, when Sirius was awakened not by crying or calling, but by the sound of toys arranging themselves in neat rows across the nursery floor. Sirius lay still for a moment, listening to the gentle clicking and scraping sounds that suggested wooden blocks and metal figurines moving of their own accord. Then quietly, he slipped out of bed and padded down the hall to Harry's room. The door was ajar, and through the gap he could see Harry sitting cross-legged in the center of his room, his face screwed up in concentration as he directed a parade of toys into orderly formations. A squadron of toy dragons marched in perfect formation across the rug. Building blocks stacked themselves into neat towers. Books arranged themselves by size on the lower shelves. "Good morning, little man," Sirius said softly, not wanting to break Harry's concentration, but unable to resist announcing his presence. Harry's eyes opened. When had he closed them? And his face broke into a delighted grin. "Padfoot, look what I can do." Around the room, toys settled gently into their designated places with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance. Harry bounced to his feet, practically vibrating with excitement. "I was thinking about how Uncle Mooney always says we should clean up our toys, and then they just started moving. I didn't even have to touch them." Controlled magic. At age 4. Sirius felt a mixture of pride and concern that was becoming increasingly familiar. Harry's magical development continued to outpace every milestone, every expectation, every guideline he'd read about magical children. "That's wonderful, Harry," Sirius said, settling onto the floor beside his godson. "Can you do it again?" Harry nodded eagerly and pointed to a stuffed hippogriff that had somehow missed the morning's organizational effort. The toy rose gently from the floor, rotated slowly in the air, and settled onto Harry's bed with the care of someone placing a treasured object. "How does it feel?" Sirius asked, genuinely curious. "When you make the magic happen?" Harry considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions. "Warm," he said finally. Like when Uncle Mooney makes hot chocolate on cold days. It starts in my tummy and goes all the way to my fingers." That was remarkably sophisticated body awareness for a 4-year-old. Most adult wizards couldn't describe their magical sensations with such clarity. "Would you like to learn more about how magic works?" Sirius asked carefully. "Not spells, you're still too young for those, but the ideas behind magic, why it happens, how it works." "Yes!" Harry's enthusiasm was immediate and wholehearted. "Can we start now?" They did start then, sitting on the nursery floor while the July morning light grew stronger outside the windows. Sirius began with the most basic concepts: magic as energy, intention as direction, emotion as fuel. Harry absorbed it all with the focused attention of someone far older than his years, asking questions that revealed an intuitive understanding of principles that most Hogwarts students struggled with. "So magic comes from Harry asked, pressing his small hand to his chest. "All magic comes from inside," Sirius confirmed. "Wands help us focus it and shape it, but the magic itself is part of you, part of who you are." "Is that why Uncle Mooney gets sick sometimes? Because his magic is different?" The question caught Sirius off guard. They'd been careful about how much they told Harry about Remus's condition, but 4-year-old Harry was remarkably observant and had clearly noticed patterns they thought they'd hidden. "Uncle Mooney has a special kind of magic," Sirius said slowly, choosing his words with care. "Once a month, his magic changes him into something different. It's not his fault, and it doesn't make him dangerous to people he loves. But it does make him tired and sore afterward. Harry nodded, as though this made perfect sense. Like when I accidentally made all the flowers bloom at once and had to take a nap? Exactly like that, Sirius said, marveling at Harry's ability to find connections and create understanding from limited information. Sometimes magic is harder on our bodies than others. Their theoretical discussion was interrupted by the arrival of the morning post, delivered by a somewhat harried-looking owl who seemed personally offended by the July heat. Among the usual birthday greetings and party confirmations was an official-looking envelope bearing the St. Mungo's seal. Sirius read the letter twice before the full meaning sank in. Dr. Miriam Strout, the healer in charge of the Janus Thicky ward for permanent spell damage, was writing to inform him that Frank and Alice Longbottom had shown some slight improvement in their condition. Nothing dramatic, a moment of recognition here, a coherent word there, but enough to give Augusta hope that they might eventually recover some small portion of their former selves. "Is that good news or bad news?" Harry asked, observing Sirius's expression with the perceptiveness that continued to astound everyone who knew him. "Complicated news," Sirius said honestly. "Some friends of ours have been very sick for a long time. The letter says they might be getting a tiny bit better. Can we visit them?" The request was so innocent, so naturally compassionate, that Sirius felt his throat tighten. Most 4-year-olds were frightened by illness, especially the kind of profound mental damage that the Longbottoms had suffered. But Harry's first instinct was to offer comfort and presence to people who were suffering. "Would you like to?" Sirius asked. "Yes. If they're Neville's mummy and daddy, they must be nice, and maybe seeing visitors will help them feel better." An hour later, they were walking through the bright antiseptic corridors of St. Mungo's, Harry's hand secure in Sirius's as they followed the familiar path to the Janus Thicky ward. Augusta Longbottom met them at the ward entrance, her usual stern expression softened by gratitude for their visit. "Harry, dear," she said, crouching down to his level with the same careful respect she'd always shown him. "Thank you for coming to see my son and his wife. They would be so pleased to know Neville's friend cared enough to visit." Harry studied Augusta's face with the gravity he brought to all important social interactions. "Are they very sick?" "Very sick," Augusta confirmed. "Their minds were hurt by bad people, and they have trouble remembering who they are or who loves them. But sometimes, just for a moment, they come back to us a little bit." The ward itself was painted in soothing pastels, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light and soft music playing from hidden speakers. Residents moved through the space with the aimless wandering of people whose minds no longer followed logical pathways. Some spoke to invisible companions. Others sat in chairs, staring at nothing with vacant expressions. Frank and Alice Longbottom sat together by a window, their chairs positioned so they could look out at the small garden beyond the glass. Frank was methodically shredding a napkin into tiny pieces, his movements repetitive and unconscious. Alice was humming tunelessly, her gaze fixed on something only she could see. "Frank? Alice?" Augusta approached them with the gentle caution of someone who had learned not to expect recognition. "I've brought visitors. This is Harry Potter. Remember, I've told you about him. Neville's friend." Frank looked up briefly, his eyes passing over Augusta and Sirius before settling on Harry. For just a moment, something flickered in his expression, confusion, perhaps, or a distant memory of what it felt like to see clearly. Alice continued humming, but her gaze shifted slightly in Harry's direction. Harry stepped forward without prompting, his small face serious but unafraid. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Longbottom. I'm Harry. Neville is my friend. He talks about you sometimes." Frank blinked slowly, his hand stilling in its napkin-shredding activity. Alice's humming changed key, becoming something that might once have been a lullaby. "Neville," Frank said suddenly, the word clear and distinct in the quiet room. Augusta drew in a sharp breath, her hand flying to her mouth. It was the first coherent word Frank had spoken in weeks. Harry, apparently taking this as encouragement, continued his one-sided conversation with remarkable composure. "Neville showed me the picture you gave him, the one where you're holding him when he was a baby. He looks just like you, Mr. Longbottom. And he's very brave, like his mummy and daddy." Alice's head turned more fully toward Harry, and for just a moment her eyes seemed to focus on his face with something approaching recognition, not of him specifically, but of something familiar in his features or his presence. "Lily," Alice whispered, her voice barely audible. The word hit Sirius like a physical blow. Alice was seeing something in Harry that reminded her of his mother, reaching for a memory of friendship that predated the curse damage. "Lily was my mummy," Harry said gently, accepting this connection with the matter-of-fact grace he brought to all emotional complexities. "She died when I was little, but Padfoot and Uncle Mooney take care of me now." They stayed for 20 minutes, Harry maintaining a quiet conversation with two people who could only occasionally understand him. When Frank managed another clear word, "brave," Harry beamed as though he'd received the highest compliment imaginable. When Alice reached out to briefly touch his hair, he stood perfectly still, allowing the contact with patient dignity. As they prepared to leave, Augusta pulled Sirius aside, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's the most coherent they've been in months," she whispered. "I don't know what it is about that child, but he reached them in a way no one else has been able to." The visit to St. Mungo's set the tone for the rest of Harry's birthday celebration. Quietly profound moments, woven through with the ordinary magic of childhood. The party at Grimold Place was larger than previous years. Weasleys, educational friends from Rosewood Academy, Andromeda and Tonks, and to everyone's surprise, a black-clad figure who arrived precisely at 3 o'clock with no ceremony or advance warning. Severus Snape stood in the doorway of the sitting room, like a particularly elegant storm cloud, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere of the cheerful gathering. Conversations faltered. Children looked up from their games with wide eyes. Even the house elves seemed to sense that something significant had shifted. "Snape," Sirius said carefully, his protective instincts immediately on high alert. "I wasn't expecting you." "I was not expecting to come," Snape replied, his dark eyes scanning the room until they found Harry, who was watching the newcomer with open curiosity rather than fear. "However, certain obligations require acknowledgement." Harry stepped forward with the confident social skills he'd developed over the past year. "Hello, I'm Harry. Are you here for my birthday party?" Snape stared down at the child for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Sirius could see him taking in details, the unruly black hair so reminiscent of James, the bright green eyes that were pure lily, the confident posture that spoke of a child who'd been raised with love and security. "I am Professor Severus Snape," Snape said finally, his voice softer than Sirius had ever heard it. "I knew your parents." "Were you friends with them?" Harry asked with the direct curiosity of someone too young to understand complicated social dynamics. "It was complicated," Snape replied, after a pause that stretched long enough to make everyone in the room uncomfortable. "Your mother she was extraordinary." Harry's face brightened. "Padfoot tells me stories about her. He says she was the smartest person in their year at school and that she could make anyone laugh, even when they were sad." Something flickered across Snape's features, pain, perhaps, or regret. "Yes, she could do that." The conversation might have continued in that delicate vein, but Harry's attention was suddenly caught by something far more interesting than adult emotional complexity. Snape's potions kit, visible through the opening of his traveling cloak. "Are those potion ingredients?" Harry asked, his eyes lighting up with genuine excitement. "Uncle Mooney showed me pictures in a book, but I've never seen real ones." Snape followed Harry's gaze to the small case at his side, surprise flickering across his features. "You're interested in potions? They're like cooking, but with magic," Harry said seriously. "Uncle Mooney says you have to be very careful with the measurements and the timing, and that every ingredient does something different." "Lupin has been teaching you potions theory." Snape's voice held a note of professional curiosity that overrode his personal discomfort. "Just the basics," Remus said, joining the conversation with careful diplomacy. "Harry shows remarkable aptitude for understanding how different elements interact." What followed was the most surreal 20 minutes of Sirius's life. Severus Snape, kneeling on the floor of the grim old place sitting room, carefully explaining the properties of various harmless potion ingredients to a fascinated 4-year-old, while a birthday party continued around them. Harry absorbed every word with the focused attention he brought to subjects that captured his interest, asking questions that revealed an intuitive understanding of brewing principles. "This one smells like Uncle Mooney's tea," Harry observed, carefully examining a sample of dried chamomile. "Chamomile has calming properties," Snape explained, his usual sharp tone notably absent. "It's often used in healing draughts and sleep aids." "Could we make Uncle Mooney's tea into a potion, to help when he doesn't feel well?" Snape went very still, his eyes flicking to Remus with an expression Sirius couldn't interpret. "That would be complex magic. Perhaps when you're older." But he didn't say no, and when he left an hour later, he pressed a small book into Harry's hands. "Basic Principles of Potion Theory for Young Minds," with instructions to read it carefully and ask questions when they next met. "When will that be?" Harry asked with typical directness. Snape hesitated, his gaze moving from Harry to Sirius to Remus and back again. "Soon," he said finally, "if your guardians permit it." After the guests had gone and Harry had been thoroughly celebrated, bathed and put to bed with his new book clutched in his small hands, Sirius found himself in the kitchen with Remus, both of them processing the day's unexpected developments. "Snape teaching Harry potions," Remus mused, shaking his head in wonder. "I never would have predicted that." "He sees Lily in him," Sirius said quietly. "It's the only thing that makes sense. Snape can't stand me. Tolerated James at best. But Lily—" He trailed off, remembering the expression on Snape's face when Harry had asked about his mother. "Harry could do worse for a potions mentor," Remus pointed out. "Whatever else Snape is, he's brilliant at his subject, and Harry clearly has the aptitude for it." "Everything about Harry is advanced," Sirius said, voicing the concern that had been growing stronger with each passing month. "His magic, his emotional intelligence, his academic abilities. Sometimes I wonder if we're doing enough for him, if we're challenging him appropriately. He's 4, Sirius. Extraordinarily gifted, yes, but still a child. The most important thing we can give him is a childhood, time to play and explore and make mistakes without the weight of the entire wizarding world on his shoulders." Upstairs, Harry called out softly, his voice carrying the drowsy contentment of someone who'd had a thoroughly satisfying day. "Padfoot? Uncle Mooney? Thank you for the best birthday ever." "Sleep well, little man," Sirius called back, his chest warm with the same feeling he'd had every day for the past 3 years. The absolute certainty that Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by people who would love and protect him, no matter what the future brought. Tomorrow they would continue working on magical theory. Tomorrow, Harry would probably ask a dozen questions about potions that would require careful, age-appropriate answers. Tomorrow there would be new challenges and new discoveries and new reasons to marvel at the remarkable child they were raising. But tonight, Harry was 4 years old and happy and safe, sleeping peacefully in a house filled with love and magic, and the promise of everything still to come. Chapter 8. Challenges and Choices. The first sign of trouble came during what should have been an ordinary morning at the Rosewood Academy. Harry was helping Mrs. Clearwater set up the day's magical creature observation lesson when raised voices from the garden drew everyone's attention to the windows. Through the glass, Harry could see Marcus Flint, a boy nearly 2 years older who'd recently joined their advanced learning group, standing over Timothy Clearwater, Mrs. Clearwater's shy 5-year-old nephew, who often struggled with even the simplest magical tasks. "You're not a real wizard," Marcus was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the spring air. "Real wizards can make magic happen whenever they want. You can barely light a candle without crying." Timothy sat hunched on the garden bench, where he'd been quietly reading, his face flushed with embarrassment and unshed tears. Around him, several other children watched with the uncomfortable fascination that came from witnessing cruelty they couldn't quite understand. Harry felt something hot and tight coil in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but something deeper. The same feeling he'd had when he'd heard the Dursleys talking about him in the weeks before Sirius came to collect him, when they'd used words like freak and unnatural, as though his magic was something to be ashamed of. "Mrs. Clearwater," Harry said quietly, tugging on his teacher's robes. "I see it, dear," Mrs. Clearwater murmured, already moving toward the garden door with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd dealt with childhood conflicts many times before. Sometimes children need help learning how to treat others kindly. But Harry was no longer listening. He was watching Marcus lean closer to Timothy, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper that wouldn't carry to the adults inside. "My father says your family shouldn't even be allowed to call themselves wizards. Says people like you make the rest of us look weak." That was enough. Harry was through the garden door before Mrs. Clearwater could stop him, his small feet carrying him across the grass with determined steps. The other children scattered slightly as he approached, sensing something in his posture that suggested trouble brewing. "Leave him alone," Harry said clearly, placing himself between Marcus and Timothy. Marcus straightened up, surprised by the interruption. At 6 years old, he had nearly 2 years and several inches on Harry, but something in the younger boy's expression made him take a step back. "This isn't your business, Potter," Marcus said, trying to regain his advantage through bluster. "Just because you're famous doesn't mean you can tell other people what to do." "I'm not telling you what to do," Harry replied, with the careful precision he'd learned from watching Sirius navigate difficult conversations. "I'm asking you to stop being cruel to someone who hasn't done anything to hurt you." "He's not a real wizard," Marcus protested, but with less conviction than before. "Look at him. He can't even do baby magic without help." Harry turned slightly to look at Timothy, who was still huddled on the bench with tears threatening to spill over. The older boy's distress was visible in the way his small hands shook and the careful way he was trying not to make eye contact with anyone. "Magic isn't about how strong you are," Harry said, turning back to Marcus with quiet authority. "It's about who you choose to be. And someone who uses their magic to hurt other people isn't a real wizard at all." "You don't know anything," Marcus sneered, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "My father says—" "Your father isn't here," Harry interrupted, and suddenly the air around them grew warmer, charged with the kind of energy that made hair stand on end and flowers turn toward the sun. "And you're being mean to someone smaller than you because it makes you feel big. That's not magic. That's just being awful." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but whatever he'd planned to say died unspoken as the garden around them began to react to Harry's emotion. Flowers bloomed brighter, grass grew greener, and the very air seemed to shimmer with protective magic that made every child present fall silent with awe. "Harry," Mrs. Clearwater's voice was gentle but firm, and Harry turned toward her with the careful attention of someone who recognized authority when he heard it. "What's happening here?" she asked, though her tone suggested she'd heard enough to understand the situation. "Marcus was being mean to Timothy," Harry said simply. "I asked him to stop." Mrs. Clearwater's gaze moved between the 3 boys, taking in Timothy's tear-stained face, Marcus's defensive posture, and the subtle magical energy that still danced around Harry like visible emotion. "Marcus," she said quietly, "we've talked about how we treat our classmates. Would you like to explain why you thought it was appropriate to make Timothy feel bad about his magical development?" What followed was a careful conversation about kindness, respect, and the different ways people learned and grew. Marcus, faced with adult disapproval and the obvious magical display he'd inadvertently provoked, mumbled an apology and retreated to the far side of the garden. Timothy, meanwhile, looked up at Harry with something approaching hero worship. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Nobody's ever stood up for me before." "Everyone deserves to feel safe," Harry replied, settling beside Timothy on the bench with the easy companionship of someone who understood what it felt like to be different. "And your magic isn't weak. It's just quiet. Some of the best magic is quiet." That afternoon, when Sirius arrived to collect Harry from Rosewood Academy, Mrs. Clearwater requested a private word. "Harry intervened in a bullying situation today," she began without preamble. "His instincts were entirely correct, and his intentions were admirable, but the magical display that accompanied his intervention was significant." Sirius felt the familiar mixture of pride and concern that came with every report of Harry's advanced abilities. How significant? Every flowering plant in the garden bloomed simultaneously. The grass grew 2 inches in 30 seconds, and there was an unmistakable feeling of protective magic in the air, the kind that usually requires deliberate casting from a trained wizard. "He's never had formal training in protective charms," Sirius said carefully. "I don't think this was a charm," Mrs. Clearwater replied. "I think this was pure emotional magic, triggered by his desire to protect someone who was being hurt. The control he showed in not actually harming the aggressor while still making his point clear. That level of magical discipline in a 4-year-old is unprecedented in my experience." That evening, Harry sat at the kitchen table at Grimmauld Place, carefully working through a potions theory exercise Severus Snape had assigned during his last visit. The work was advanced for his age, but Harry approached it with the same focused attention he brought to all learning. "How was school today, little man?" Sirius asked, settling into the chair beside him. Harry looked up from his parchment, his green eyes serious. There was a boy being mean to Timothy because Timothy's magic is different from his. I made him stop. Mrs. Clearwater told me about that. She said you stood up for your friend. "Was that wrong?" Harry asked, and Sirius could hear the genuine uncertainty in his voice. "Uncle Mooney says we should always be kind to people, but Marcus wasn't being kind, and asking him nicely wasn't working." Sirius chose his words carefully, aware that this conversation would help shape Harry's understanding of right and wrong for years to come. "You weren't wrong to protect Timothy," he said finally. "When someone is being hurt and you have the power to stop it, staying silent can be wrong too. But you showed remarkable control in how you handled it. You could have hurt Marcus, but you chose not to. That shows wisdom." "I don't like hurting people," Harry said simply. "Even people who are mean." "That's good, Harry. That's something that makes you a good person. But sometimes people will try to hurt you or hurt people you care about, and you'll need to decide how to respond. The important thing is that your first thought should always be to protect, not to attack." Harry nodded solemnly, filing this guidance away with the careful attention he gave to all important lessons. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Remus, who looked more tired than usual, and was carrying what appeared to be a large basket of teaching materials. "How was your day with the Tonks family?" Sirius asked, rising to help with the basket. "Productive," Remus replied, though there was something strained in his voice. "Andromeda's asked me to tutor Nymphadora in defense against the dark arts. Her marks at school have been concerning." Harry looked up with sharp interest. "Is Tonks in trouble?" "Not trouble, exactly," Remus said carefully. "But she's having difficulty with some of her coursework, and her mother thought extra help might benefit her." What Remus didn't say But what Sirius could read in his expression was that 12-year-old Nymphadora Tonks was having the same difficulties many magical children experienced when approaching adolescence. Her metamorphmagus abilities were fluctuating wildly in response to emotional stress, making it nearly impossible for her to concentrate on traditional spellwork. "Will you still have time for our lessons?" Harry asked, and Sirius caught the note of worry in his voice that suggested this question had been building for some time. "Of course," Remus said immediately, settling into his usual chair at the table. "Harry, you'll always be a priority. But Tonks needs help too, and her family has been very good to us. We help people when we can." Harry nodded, but Sirius could see the uncertainty in his small face. At not quite 5 years old, Harry's understanding of loyalty and commitment was still developing, and the idea that his beloved Uncle Mooney might have other obligations was clearly unsettling. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Remus spent 2 afternoons a week at the Tonks house, working with Nymphadora on control techniques and basic defensive magic. He always returned home in time for dinner, always made time for Harry's own lessons and questions, but Harry's behavior began to show subtle signs of stress. He became clingy in ways he hadn't been since his first few months at Grimold Place, following Sirius and Remus around the house with determined attention. His sleep grew restless, interrupted by dreams he couldn't or wouldn't describe. Most tellingly, his accidental magic increased in frequency and intensity, lights flickering when he was upset, toys rearranging themselves when he felt ignored, flowers wilting when his mood turned dark. The crisis came on a rainy Thursday in late March, when Remus had to cancel their planned trip to Diagon Alley because Nymphadora was having what Andromeda described as a magical emergency. "I'm sorry, Harry," Remus said, kneeling down to Harry's level as he explained the change in plans. "Tonks is having trouble controlling her abilities today, and her mother is worried. I need to help her." Harry's face went very still, the way it did when he was trying not to cry. "You promised we would go see the new books today." "I know, and we will. Tomorrow or this weekend. But right now, Tonks needs help, and—" "Tonks always needs help," Harry interrupted, his voice small but sharp with hurt. "And you always go help her, instead of being with me." The accusation hung in the air between them, devastating in its simplicity. Remus looked stricken. Sirius felt his heart break a little, and Harry's eyes filled with tears he was trying desperately not to shed. "Harry," Remus began gently. "I know she's important," Harry continued, the words tumbling out in a rush of pain and confusion. "I know you have to help her. But what if you help her so much that you don't want to live with us anymore? What if you decide her family is better than our family?" The fear underneath the words was unmistakable. The terror of abandonment that every orphaned child carried, the knowledge that people could disappear from your life without warning or explanation. Sirius moved immediately, scooping Harry up in his arms and settling into the chair by the window, where they'd shared countless conversations over the years. "That's never going to happen," Sirius said firmly. "Uncle Mooney is never going to leave us. We're family, Harry. That means we stay together, no matter what. But he likes helping Tonks more than he likes helping me," Harry said, his small face buried in Sirius's shoulder. "No," Remus said quietly, moving to sit beside them. "Harry, look at me." Harry turned his head slightly, green eyes bright with unshed tears. "You are the most important thing in my life," Remus said with quiet intensity. "You and Sirius are my family. Helping Tonks is something I do because it's right, and because her family has been kind to us. But if I had to choose between helping her and being here with you, I would choose you every single time." "Really?" Harry's voice was very small. "Really. And tomorrow, we'll go to Diagon Alley, just the 2 of us, and you can pick out as many books as you want. And maybe we'll stop for ice cream, and maybe we'll visit the joke shop, and we'll spend the whole day doing exactly what you want to do." Harry considered this offer with the gravity he brought to all important negotiations. "And you won't cancel if Tonks needs help?" "Tonks will have to wait," Remus said firmly. "Tomorrow is Harry Day." That seemed to satisfy something deep inside Harry's 4-year-old heart. He nodded solemnly and settled more comfortably in Sirius's arms, the tension leaving his small body. "I'm sorry I was upset," Harry said after a moment. "I know helping people is good. I don't want anyone to leave." "We're not leaving," Sirius said, pressing a kiss to the top of Harry's head. "We're never leaving. You're stuck with us for as long as you want us." "Forever?" Harry asked hopefully. "Forever," Sirius confirmed. As it turned out, the conversation marked a turning point in their family dynamics. Remus continued helping Nymphadora, but he became more deliberate about balancing his time and attention. Harry, reassured of his place in the family hierarchy, began to relax into his previous confidence. And Sirius, watching both of them navigate this complex emotional terrain, felt a deep pride in how they were learning to communicate their needs and fears with honest openness. The incident at Rosewood Academy, meanwhile, had longer-term consequences. Word spread through the small community of magical families about Harry Potter's intervention in defense of a struggling classmate, and about the remarkable magical control he'd shown in the process. Some parents expressed concern about such power in so young a child. Others spoke approvingly of his protective instincts and moral courage. But perhaps most significantly, Timothy Clearwater's family approached Sirius and Remus about arranging regular playdates between the boys. Timothy, they explained, had been transformed by Harry's friendship, more confident in his abilities, less afraid of making mistakes, eager to learn in ways he'd never been before. "Harry has a gift for making people feel safe," Timothy's mother observed during one such playdate, watching Harry patiently help Timothy practice a simple levitation charm. Not just because of his power, but because of his heart. That's a rare combination. Sirius, watching Harry guide Timothy's wand movements with gentle encouragement, had to agree. Power without compassion was the path that had led to Voldemort. Compassion without power was helplessness in the face of evil. But power guided by compassion, tempered by wisdom, and grounded in love. That, Sirius thought, was exactly what the wizarding world needed. And it was exactly what James and Lily would have wanted their son to become. Chapter 9. The Wider Wizarding World. The Delacour family. Chateau rose from the Provence countryside like something from a fairy tale, its pale stone walls gleaming in the late afternoon sun, and its towers topped with flags that shifted color with the changing light. Harry pressed his nose to the window of the magical carriage that had collected them from the international flu station in Marseille, his green eyes wide with fascination. "It's beautiful," he breathed, his voice carrying the awe of a 6-year-old seeing true magnificence for the first time. "Wait until you see the inside," Sirius said, amused by Harry's reaction. "The Delacours have been collecting magical artifacts for centuries. Their library alone is supposed to rival the one at Hogwarts." Harry turned away from the window, his expression suddenly serious in the way that meant he was processing something important. "Why did they invite us? They don't really know us, do they?" It was a perceptive question, and one that Sirius had been expecting. The invitation had come through Remus's new position with the International Confederation of Wizards Educational Exchange Program, a role that required him to travel occasionally, but had the advantage of exposing Harry to magical communities beyond Britain's borders. The Delacours, prominent in French magical society and known for their progressive views on international cooperation, had specifically requested to meet the famous Harry Potter and his guardians. "They're interested in meeting you because of who you are," Sirius said carefully, "but not just because you're famous. They've heard about your education, your development, the way you've been raised. They want to see for themselves what kind of person you're becoming." "Are they testing me?" Harry asked, and there was no fear in his voice, just curiosity. In a way, yes, but not the kind of test you can fail. They just want to understand you. The carriage drew to a halt before the chateau's main entrance, where a small group of people waited to greet them. At the center stood a woman of such striking beauty that even Harry, at 6 years old, found himself staring. Her silver blonde hair caught the light like spun moonbeams, and when she smiled, the very air around her seemed to shimmer with warmth. "Apolline Delacour," Sirius murmured quietly. "Part Vila, like her daughter. Be polite, but don't stare too long." Beside Apolline stood a tall, distinguished man with kind eyes and an air of quiet authority, presumably her husband, Sebastian. And partially hidden behind her mother's elegant robes was a girl of perhaps 9 years old, watching their arrival with the intense curiosity that seemed universal among magical children. "Monsieur Black, Monsieur Lupin," Apolline greeted them as they stepped down from the carriage, her English accented but perfectly clear. "And you must be Harry. We are so pleased to welcome you to our home." Harry stepped forward with the confident politeness that 4 years of careful social education had instilled in him. "Thank you for inviting us, Madame Delacour. Your house is very beautiful." "Merci beaucoup," Apolline said, her smile widening with obvious delight. "And already you are learning French. Très bien." The girl behind her mother stepped forward slightly, revealing herself to be as striking as her parent, though in a more childish way. Her silver blonde hair was braided with ribbons that seemed to flutter without any breeze, and her blue eyes held the same intense intelligence Harry had noticed in the most advanced students at Rosewood Academy. "Je suis Fleur," she said, offering Harry a small curtsy that seemed both formal and playful. "I am pleased to meet the famous Harry Potter." "I'm pleased to meet you too," Harry replied, and then, with the fearless curiosity that characterized all his learning, added carefully, "Je suis contente de vous rencontrer." Fleur's face lit up with delight, and she clapped her hands together. "Excellent! Your pronunciation, it is very good for a beginner. Papa, did you hear? He speaks French." What followed was a whirlwind introduction to magical French society, unlike anything Harry had experienced. The Delacour Chateau wasn't just a home. It was a gathering place for influential magical families from across Europe, all of whom seemed to have arrived for what Sebastian described as a small summer salon. Over the next 3 days, Harry found himself in conversation with young witches and wizards from Germany, Italy, Spain, and even as far away as Bulgaria. Each family brought their own magical traditions, their own ways of understanding and practicing magic, and their own perspectives on the role of magical people in the wider world. "In Italy," explained Marco Rossetti, an 11-year-old boy whose family specialized in magical architecture, "we learn that magic should be beautiful first, useful second. Every spell, it must have eleganza." "But in Germany," countered Gretchen Müller, a serious-faced 10-year-old whose grandmother was a renowned potioneer, "we say efficiency is the highest beauty. Magic that wastes energy is magic that fails when you need it most." Harry absorbed these different viewpoints with the intellectual hunger that had characterized his learning from the beginning. At 6 years old, he was already beginning to understand that magic wasn't just about power or even knowledge. It was about philosophy, about how you chose to see and interact with the world. But perhaps the most fascinating conversations came when the subject turned to the relationship between magical and non-magical people. "Why do we hide?" Harry asked one evening, as the children gathered in the chateau's spectacular library, their voices echoing softly among shelves that stretched up 3 stories and seemed to extend into shadows that didn't quite obey normal geometric rules. It was Fleur who answered, her young voice carrying the weight of lessons learned at her parents' knees. "Because the muggles, they fear what they do not understand. And when people are afraid, they become dangerous." "But we're not dangerous," Harry protested. "Not if we use magic to help people." "No, but they do not know that," said Philippe Rousseau, a 12-year-old from a long line of French auras. "They see magic, and they think of the old stories. Witches who steal children, wizards who curse crops, sorcerers who make bargains with devils. They cannot tell the difference between good magic and dark magic, because to them, all magic is dark." Harry considered this with the serious attention he brought to all complex problems. Around him, the other children watched with interest, clearly curious about how the famous boy who lived would respond to these fundamental questions about their world. "But that means they'll always be afraid," Harry said slowly. "If we never show them that magic can be good, if we never let them see who we really are, how will they ever learn that they don't need to be scared?" The library fell quiet. Even for children raised in progressive magical families, Harry's question struck at the heart of centuries of policy and tradition. The International Statute of Secrecy wasn't just law, it was the foundation upon which their entire world was built. "It is complicated," Fleur said finally, her young voice thoughtful. "My grandmère, she remembers the stories of the witch trials. When Muggles burned people they thought were magical. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they were wrong, but always they were afraid." "But that was a long time ago," Harry pointed out. "People change, don't they? They learn new things, they get smarter about the world." "Some do," said Elena Marchetti, a quiet girl from Rome whose family studied Muggle magical relations. "My papa, he works with the International Confederation. He says there are Muggles now who study things that are almost like magic. How to speak across great distances instantly, how to fly in metal birds, how to see inside people's bodies without cutting them open. Perhaps they would not be so afraid of magic now." "But perhaps they would be more afraid," Gretchen countered. "If they understand a little magic, they might want to control it, use it for war, or to make money." The conversation continued long into the evening, with Sirius and Remus occasionally joining in to guide the discussion when it threatened to become too abstract for young minds to handle. But Harry noticed that the adults were learning as much as the children, that questions like his were being taken seriously by some of the most important magical families in Europe. On their final day at the chateau, Harry found himself alone in the garden with Fleur, both of them sitting beside a fountain that played musical notes as the water fell. The older girl had become something of a mentor during their visit, helping him with French pronunciation and explaining cultural nuances he might have missed. "Do you think the hiding will always continue?" Fleur asked, picking up the thread of their previous evening's discussion. Harry was quiet for a long moment, watching the musical water dance through the air in patterns that followed no earthly rhythm. "I think," he said slowly, "that if we're brave enough to be good examples and patient enough to wait for people to be ready, maybe someday we won't have to hide anymore." "That would take a very long time," Fleur observed. "Probably longer than we'll live," Harry agreed. "But maybe we can start. Maybe we can be the ones who figure out how to do it safely." Fleur studied his profile with the intensity of someone far older than her 9 years. "You are different from what I expected." "How so?" "The stories about you, they focus on the power, on the magic you survived, on the Dark Lord you defeated. But I think the most interesting thing about Harry Potter is how you think about problems. You do not accept that things must always be the way they have always been." Harry turned to look at her, struck by the insight. "Is that good or bad?" "I think," Fleur said with a smile that seemed to light up the garden around them, "that it is exactly what the world needs." The journey back to England was quieter than the trip to France had been, with Harry lost in thought as he processed everything he'd seen and learned. As their carriage rolled through the English countryside toward London, Sirius watched his godson's face with growing curiosity. "What are you thinking about, little man?" Harry looked up from the book of French fairy tales Fleur had given him as a parting gift. "The children I met, they're all so different from each other. Different ways of doing magic, different ways of thinking about muggles, different ideas about what magic should be for. But they're all still magical people." "That's right. And in England, most of the magical people I know think the same way about most things. They agree about the statute of secrecy and about keeping magic separate from muggle life and about how children should be educated." Sirius felt a spark of pride at Harry's observation. "What do you think that means?" "I think it means that there are lots of different ways to be a magical person," Harry said slowly. "And maybe the English way isn't the only right way. Maybe if I learn about different ways, I can choose the parts that make the most sense. That's a very mature way of thinking." Harry was quiet for another moment, then looked up at Sirius with the earnest expression that meant he was about to say something important. "Padfoot? When I'm older, when I have to make decisions about how to use my magic and who to be, will you help me think through all the different possibilities?" "Always," Sirius said without hesitation. "That's what family is for." "Good," Harry said, settling back into his seat with obvious satisfaction. "Because I think I'm going to have a lot of thinking to do." As their carriage approached London and the familiar sights of home, Sirius reflected on how much Harry had grown during their brief time abroad. Not just intellectually, though his language acquisition and cultural understanding had been remarkable. More importantly, Harry had begun to see himself as part of something larger than the British magical community, as a member of an international magical society with responsibilities that transcended national boundaries. At 6 years old, Harry Potter was already developing the kind of global perspective that would serve him well in whatever role he eventually chose to play in the wizarding world. And perhaps more importantly, he was learning to question assumptions, to seek out different viewpoints, and to think critically about the world he'd inherited. It was, Sirius thought as they pulled into the familiar station at King's Cross, exactly the kind of education James and Lily would have wanted for their son. One that prepared him not just to fit into the world as it was, but to help shape the world as it could be. That evening, as Harry carefully arranged his new books and artifacts from their trip in his ever-expanding collection, he looked up at Sirius with bright, curious eyes. "When can we visit Germany?" he asked. "Gretchen said their magical schools start teaching potions when children are 7. I'd like to see how they do it differently from Professor Snape." Sirius laughed, recognizing the beginning of what would probably be many requests for international educational experiences. "We'll see what we can arrange. The world is a big place, Harry. There's plenty of time to explore it." "Good," Harry said seriously. "I have a lot to learn." Indeed he did, Sirius thought, and the wizarding world had much to learn from him in return. Chapter 10. Preparing for Greater Things. The snow falling outside the library windows at Grimold Place created a cocoon of warmth and concentration as Harry bent over a thick tome titled Fundamental Principles of Defensive Magic, a Theoretical Approach. At 6.5 years old, he looked almost comically small behind the massive book, but his expression carried the focused intensity of a much older student. "The key to any successful shield charm," he read aloud, carefully sounding out the more complex words, "lies not in the power behind the casting, but in the caster's absolute conviction that protection is both necessary and achievable." Across the table, Professor McGonagall watched with the sharp attention she usually reserved for her most promising 7th years. She had arrived an hour earlier for what Sirius had described as an informal educational assessment, but what had quickly become something far more significant, a recognition that Harry Potter's magical education could no longer follow conventional timelines. "Interesting," McGonagall said quietly. "What do you think that means, Harry?" Harry looked up from the book, his green eyes bright with the intellectual curiosity that had characterized his learning from the beginning. "I think it means that magic responds to what we believe, not just what we want. If you cast a shield charm, but you don't really believe it will work, then it won't work even if you have enough magical power. And why might that be? Because magic comes from inside, Harry said, unconsciously echoing lessons Sirius had taught him years earlier. It's not just energy, it's intention and emotion and understanding all mixed together. So if you don't understand why you need protection, or if you don't believe you deserve to be safe, then the magic gets confused. McGonagall exchanged a meaningful glance with Sirius, who was sitting nearby pretending to read the Daily Prophet while actually listening to every word of the conversation. That's a remarkably sophisticated understanding of magical theory, McGonagall observed. Most students don't grasp those concepts until their 5th or 6th year at Hogwarts. Professor Snape explained it to me when we were working on healing potions, Harry said matter-of-factly. He said the reason some potions work better for some people than others isn't because of brewing skill. It's because the brewer's intentions become part of the magic. So if you're making a healing potion, but you don't care whether the person gets better, the potion won't work as well. And you've been studying with Professor Snape regularly? Every other week, Harry confirmed. He's teaching me about how different ingredients interact and how to recognize what a potion is supposed to do by looking at the color and smell. He says I have good instincts for it. That was putting it mildly, Sirius reflected. Severus Snape, who had never been accused of giving undeserved praise, had privately told Sirius that Harry showed more natural aptitude for potions than any student he'd encountered in 20 years of teaching. The boy could look at a brewing potion and somehow sense whether the magical interactions were proceeding correctly, even when the visible signs were too subtle for most adults to detect. Professor McGonagall, Harry said suddenly, closing the defensive magic book and fixing her with the direct gaze that meant he was about to ask an important question. Padfoot says you're here to see if I'm ready for more advanced lessons. Does that mean I might be able to go to Hogwarts early? The question hung in the air with the weight of everything unsaid. Harry's intellectual hunger, his magical advancement, his social maturity, and underneath it all, his deep need to understand where he fit in the world that had made him famous before he could walk. Not exactly, McGonagall said carefully. Hogwarts has very specific age requirements, and those exist for good reasons. Magical education isn't just about academic readiness. It's about emotional and social development as well. Harry's face fell, slightly, though he tried to hide his disappointment. However, McGonagall continued, that doesn't mean your education needs to wait until you're 11. There are alternative approaches for students with exceptional circumstances. She turned to address Sirius and Remus, who had joined them at the library table. I've been discussing Harry's situation with Professor Dumbledore and several other members of the Hogwarts faculty. We're prepared to offer him a modified educational program, advanced tutoring with various professors, access to certain areas of the castle for specialized instruction, and gradual integration with older students who might benefit from working with someone of his abilities. What would that look like practically? Remus asked, his voice carefully neutral, though Sirius could see the tension in his posture. 1 or 2 days a week at Hogwarts, working directly with professors in their areas of expertise. The rest of his time would continue as it is now, with you, with his current tutors, with the educational groups he's already part of. McGonagall's expression softened slightly as she looked at Harry. It would be a chance to explore the subjects that interest you most, while still maintaining your family connections. Harry's eyes had grown wide with excitement. I could really study at Hogwarts, even though I'm not 11 yet. You could study at Hogwarts, McGonagall confirmed. Though I should warn you, the work would be considerably more challenging than what you're used to. We wouldn't be treating you as a 6-year-old with exceptional abilities. We'd be treating you as a student capable of handling advanced material with all the expectations that entails. I want to try, Harry said immediately, then looked towards Sirius and Remus with an expression that mixed eagerness with uncertainty. If it's all right with Padfoot and Uncle Mooney. The conversation that followed was complex, involving discussions of transportation logistics, security arrangements, and the emotional impact of such a significant change in Harry's routine. But underneath all the practical considerations lay a deeper tension, the recognition that Harry was approaching the age where his education would necessarily begin to separate him from the intensive family environment that had shaped his first 6 years. Later that evening, after McGonagall had returned to Hogwarts with promises to finalize the details of Harry's proposed program, Sirius found himself sitting in Harry's room as the boy prepared for bed. "Are you excited about studying at Hogwarts?" Sirius asked, helping Harry organize the stack of books that had somehow migrated from the library to his bedside table. "Very excited," Harry said immediately, then paused, but also a little scared. "What are you scared of?" Harry was quiet for a long moment, carefully folding his clothes with the precise habits Remus had instilled in him. "What if the other students don't like me? What if they think I'm showing off or that I'm getting special treatment because I'm famous?" It was a remarkably mature concern, and one that spoke to Harry's growing awareness of how his reputation preceded him in the wizarding world. "Some of them might think that," Sirius said honestly, "but the students who get to know you will realize that you're not there to show off. You're there to learn. And the ones who can't see past your fame, well, they're probably not the kind of people you'd want as friends anyway." "Like Marcus Flint was with Timothy," Harry said, making the connection to his earlier experience with bullying. "Exactly like that. You stood up for Timothy because it was the right thing to do, not because you wanted to prove how powerful you were. The students at Hogwarts will see the same thing, that you're there because you love learning, not because you think you're better than everyone else." Harry nodded slowly, processing this reassurance. "Will you and Uncle Mooney still help me with my lessons when I'm studying at Hogwarts too?" "Always," Sirius promised. "Whatever you learn at Hogwarts, we'll help you understand and practice at home. And if you ever have problems, or if you're unhappy with how things are going, we'll figure out different arrangements. This isn't permanent, Harry. It's just an experiment to see if it helps you learn better." "What if I like it so much that I want to go to Hogwarts all the time instead of staying?" "Home?" Harry asked, and Sirius could hear the worry in his voice, the fear that growing up meant leaving his family behind. "Then we'll talk about what that would mean," Sirius said gently. "But Harry, no matter where you go to school, no matter how much you learn or how old you get, you're always going to be our son. That doesn't change because you spend some days learning somewhere else." Harry seemed to find comfort in this assurance. As Sirius tucked him into bed and dimmed the magical lights that illuminated the room, Harry spoke up once more. "Padfoot, when I start studying at Hogwarts, will you teach me the special black family magic that Aunt Andromeda mentioned? The protective kind?" Sirius paused in the doorway, surprised by the request. He'd been putting off Harry's introduction to the more advanced black family magical traditions, partly because of their association with his own difficult childhood, and partly because he wasn't sure how much of that legacy he wanted to pass on. "Why do you want to learn it?" he asked. "Because if I'm going to be around older students who might not like me, and if I'm going to be learning more powerful magic, I should probably know how to protect myself and other people properly," Harry said with the straightforward logic that characterized most of his thinking. "And because it's part of who I am, isn't it? Part of my family." "Yes," Sirius said quietly. "It is part of who you are, and if you want to learn it, I'll teach you. But we'll start with the protective magic, not the other kinds." "What other kinds?" Harry asked with immediate curiosity. "The kinds that are better left forgotten," Sirius said firmly. "The Black family has a long history, Harry, and not all of it is good. I want to give you the best parts of that legacy while leaving the dark parts buried." Harry considered this with the seriousness he brought to all discussions of good and evil. "That's what you've been doing all along, isn't it? Taking the good parts from different families and different kinds of magic to help me learn the best way to be a wizard." "That's exactly what we've been doing," Sirius confirmed, feeling a surge of pride at Harry's understanding. Over the following weeks, as the details of Harry's Hogwarts program were finalized, the household at Grimmauld Place took on a new energy. Harry threw himself into preparation with characteristic enthusiasm, practicing advanced charms theory, memorizing the properties of magical creatures he might encounter in Care of Magical Creatures classes, and working through increasingly complex potions exercises under Severus Snape's demanding tutelage. But perhaps more importantly, the family began establishing new traditions designed to maintain their connection, as Harry's world expanded beyond their immediate circle. Sunday dinners became inviolate. No matter what Harry was learning or where he was studying, Sunday evening would always be family time at Grimmauld Place. They established a correspondence ritual, with Harry writing letters home even on the days he was at Hogwarts, describing what he'd learned and asking questions about anything that puzzled him. And they began what Remus termed integration discussions, regular conversations where Harry could talk about his experiences, compare different teaching approaches, and work through any social or academic challenges he encountered. The goal, Remus explained to Sirius one evening, as they watched Harry practice a particularly complex wand movement that Professor Flitwick had taught him, isn't to slow down his educational development. It's to make sure his emotional development keeps pace with his intellectual growth. "Are we doing the right thing?" Sirius asked, voicing the doubt that had been gnawing at him since McGonagall's visit. "Letting him move into more advanced education so young?" "Look at him," Remus said simply. Sirius looked. Harry was absorbed in his practice, his face bright with concentration and satisfaction as he successfully completed the charm sequence. When he succeeded, he looked immediately toward his guardians, seeking their approval and sharing his accomplishment. When he struggled with a particular movement, he asked for help without shame or frustration. He was, quite clearly, a child who thrived on learning and who had developed the emotional security necessary to handle both success and failure with equal grace. "He's ready," Sirius admitted. "Not for everything, not to be thrust into a completely adult educational environment, but he's ready for more challenge, more complexity, more opportunity to develop his gifts." "And we're ready to support him through it," Remus added. "That's what makes this possible, not just his abilities, but our commitment to helping him navigate whatever comes next." On the last Sunday before Harry's first official day at Hogwarts, they held what Harry dubbed a family council meeting in the library at Grimmauld Place. It was a tradition they'd established for making important decisions together, ensuring that everyone's concerns and expectations were clearly understood. "I'm excited about learning new things," Harry began, following the format they'd developed for these discussions. "I'm nervous about meeting older students who might not want to be friends with someone younger. I'm worried about being away from home even 2 days a week, and I'm hopeful that this will help me understand how to use my magic to help other people." "I'm proud of how mature you've become," Sirius said when it was his turn. "I'm anxious about letting you move into a more independent educational environment. I'm confident that you'll handle whatever challenges come up. And I'm grateful that we've found a way to support your growth without losing our family connection." "I'm impressed by your intellectual development," Remus added. "I'm concerned about maintaining the right balance between challenge and support. I'm optimistic about what you'll accomplish with access to Hogwarts resources. And I'm committed to helping you integrate these new experiences with everything you've already learned." It was, Sirius reflected, exactly the kind of thoughtful, honest communication that had allowed them to navigate every challenge they'd faced as a family. Harry's education was about to become more complex, but the foundation they'd built together, trust, love, open communication, and unwavering support, would see them through whatever came next. "Tomorrow," Harry said as they concluded their meeting, "I start learning how to be the kind of wizard I want to be when I grow up." "Tomorrow," Sirius agreed. "You take the next step in a journey we're all taking together." And that, he thought, was exactly as it should be. Chapter 11. The Calm Before Hogwarts. The morning of Harry's 7th birthday dawned clear and warm, with the kind of perfect July sunshine that seemed designed specifically for celebration. Sirius woke to find Harry already up and dressed, sitting by the window in his room, with a book open in his lap, but clearly too excited to concentrate on reading. "Happy birthday, little man," Sirius said, settling beside him on the window seat. "Thank you," Harry replied, his green eyes bright with anticipation. 7 feels different from 6. How so? Harry considered this with the careful thought he brought to all important questions. Bigger. More responsible, somehow. Like I'm old enough now to understand things I wasn't ready for before. It was a remarkably mature observation, and one that proved prescient. Over the past 6 months of studying at Hogwarts twice a week, Harry had indeed grown into a deeper understanding of both magic and his place in the wizarding world. The shy 6-year-old, who had been nervous about meeting older students, had developed into a confident 7-year-old who could hold his own in discussions with 5th years about advanced transfiguration theory. "Professor Dumbledore is coming today," Harry continued, his voice carrying a note of nervous excitement. "Padfoot, why does he want to talk to me on my birthday? Is it about something important?" Sirius felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Harry's famous status intruded on their carefully protected family life. They'd been able to give Harry 7 years of relative normalcy, of being simply a beloved child rather than the boy who lived. But there were conversations that could no longer be postponed, realities that Harry needed to understand as he grew older and more capable of handling complex truths. "Very important," Sirius said honestly. "But nothing bad. Professor Dumbledore has been waiting until you were old enough to understand certain things about your past and your future. He thinks 7 is old enough." Harry nodded solemnly, filing this information away with his usual careful attention. "Will you and Uncle Mooney be there too?" "Every moment," Sirius promised. "Whatever Professor Dumbledore wants to discuss, we'll face it together as a family." The birthday celebration itself was wonderful in the way that only childhood birthdays could be. The garden at Grimold Place filled with friends and family, the Weasleys with their characteristic chaos and warmth, Augusta Longbottom with Neville in tow, the Clearwaters and other families from Harry's educational programs, even Severus Snape, who arrived precisely on time with a wrapped gift and his usual expression of mild disdain for social gatherings. Harry moved through the party with the confident social skills that 6 years of love and security had given him, thanking guests for gifts, ensuring quieter children like Neville felt included, and mediating the inevitable disputes that arose when Fred and George Weasley encountered anything that could potentially be turned into a prank. "He's remarkable," observed Professor Flitwick, who had joined them from Hogwarts, along with several other faculty members. "I've been teaching for 40 years, and I've never seen a child his age handle social situations with such grace and maturity." "He's had good teachers," Remus replied, watching Harry help Timothy Clearwater with a magical puzzle that was proving frustrating. Not just academically, but in terms of understanding how to treat other people with kindness and respect. The academic reports from Harry's Hogwarts instructors had been uniformly excellent. Professor McGonagall noted his exceptional grasp of transfiguration theory and his ability to visualize complex magical transformations. Professor Flitwick praised his instinctive understanding of charm work and his remarkable precision with wand movements. Even Professor Snape had grudgingly acknowledged that Harry's potions work was acceptable for someone of his age, which those who knew Snape understood to be extraordinarily high praise. But perhaps more importantly, Harry had integrated socially with the older students he studied alongside. The initial concerns about jealousy or resentment had proved largely unfounded. Harry's genuine humility and eagerness to learn had won over most of his classmates, while his willingness to help struggling students with concepts he grasped quickly had earned him real friendships rather than mere tolerance. As the afternoon party wound down and the last guests departed with promises to see each other soon, Albus Dumbledore arrived through the fireplace with his characteristic combination of dramatic flair and gentle warmth. He was dressed in robes of deep blue decorated with silver stars, and his long beard was caught back with what appeared to be a clip shaped like a miniature phoenix. "Harry, my dear boy," Dumbledore said, his blue eyes twinkling with genuine affection as he approached. "Many happy returns of the day. 7 years old. Quite a milestone." "Thank you, Professor Dumbledore," Harry replied, with the polite attention he gave to all important adult visitors. "Padfoot said you wanted to talk to me about something important." "Indeed I do. But first, I believe this belongs to you." Dumbledore produced a wrapped package from somewhere within his robes. A gift that was clearly magical, as it seemed to shift and shimmer in ways that suggested the contents were unusual, even by wizarding standards. Harry accepted the gift with careful hands, unwrapping it to reveal a beautiful leather-bound book. The title, embossed in gold lettering that seemed to move slightly when viewed directly, read "The Potter Family, a History." "Oh," Harry breathed, running his fingers over the cover with reverent care. "Is this about my mummy and daddy?" "About them, and about their families going back many generations," Dumbledore confirmed. "Your father's line has a long and distinguished history in the magical world, Harry, as does your mother's, though hers is written in different kinds of achievements. I thought it was time you knew more about the legacy you carry." Harry opened the book carefully, revealing pages filled with moving photographs, detailed family trees, and accounts of various Potter family members' contributions to magical society. Sirius could see him becoming absorbed immediately, his natural curiosity drawing him into the stories of ancestors he'd never known existed. "However," Dumbledore continued gently, "the gift can wait a few moments longer. There are other matters we should discuss first." They settled in the library, the same room where so many of Harry's important conversations had taken place over the years. Dumbledore took the chair across from the sofa where Harry sat between Sirius and Remus, his expression becoming more serious, though no less kind. "Harry," Dumbledore began, "you know that you are famous in the wizarding world because you survived something that no one else has ever survived. You know that a very dark wizard tried to kill you when you were a baby, and that somehow his magic couldn't harm you." Harry nodded. This was familiar ground. The basic story of his survival had been explained to him years earlier, in age-appropriate terms. "What you don't know," Dumbledore continued, "is why that dark wizard, Voldemort, chose to target your family specifically. Why he believed it was so important to kill you that he was willing to risk everything to do it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sirius felt Remus tense beside him, both of them recognizing that they had reached the moment they'd been dreading and anticipating for years, the moment when Harry would learn about the prophecy that had shaped his entire life. "Was it because of something my parents did?" Harry asked, his voice steady but his eyes wide with concern. "In a way, yes, but not in the way you might think. Your parents were indeed fighting against Voldemort and his followers. They were part of a group called the Order of the Phoenix, dedicated to protecting innocent people from dark magic. But Voldemort's interest in you specifically came from something else. A prophecy." Harry's brow furrowed with concentration. "What's a prophecy?" "A prophecy is a prediction about the future, made by someone with a special magical gift for seeing what might come to pass," Dumbledore explained patiently. "The prophecy about you was made before you were born, and it suggested that you would grow up to have the power to defeat Voldemort permanently." "Me?" Harry's voice squeaked slightly with surprise. "But I'm just 7 years old. I can barely manage a proper levitation charm." "Prophecies are not about current abilities, Harry. They speak to potential, to what might be possible given time, training, and circumstances." The prophecy suggested that someone born at the end of July, to parents who had fought Voldemort 3 times, would have the power to vanquish him. You and Neville Longbottom both fit those conditions, but Voldemort chose to pursue you. Harry was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the careful attention he brought to all complex problems. Around them, the library was silent except for the soft ticking of an antique clock and the distant sound of London traffic beyond the magical protections surrounding Grimold Place. "Does that mean I have to fight him someday?" Harry asked finally, and his voice was very small. "It means," Dumbledore said gently, "that you may have the choice to fight him, if he ever returns. But having the power to do something and being required to do it are very different things, Harry. The prophecy speaks of potential, not obligation. But if I'm the only one who can stop him from hurting people, and if I choose not to fight, then those people will get hurt because of my choice," Harry said, with the logic that had characterized his moral reasoning since he was very young. Sirius felt a surge of pride mixed with heartbreak at the response. Even at 7 years old, Harry understood the weight of power and the responsibility that came with it. This was exactly the kind of moral reasoning that made him James and Lily's son, exactly the quality that would serve him well whatever the future brought. "That is a very mature way of thinking about a very complex situation," Dumbledore observed. "But you are 7 years old, Harry. If Voldemort does return, and we hope he never will, you will not face him as a child. You will have years to grow, to learn, to develop not just your magical abilities, but your understanding of right and wrong, your capacity for making difficult decisions, and your knowledge of what you truly believe is worth fighting for." "Will you help me learn?" Harry asked, looking around at the 3 men who had shaped his understanding of the world. "All of you?" "Every step of the way," Sirius promised immediately. "Whatever comes, we face it together," Remus added. "For as long as I am able," Dumbledore confirmed. "Though I hope that by the time any such choices must be made, you will have grown into wisdom that surpasses even what I can teach you." Harry seemed to find comfort in these assurances. He settled back against the sofa cushions, his small frame relaxed but his expression thoughtful. "Professor Dumbledore," he said after another long pause, "if there's a prophecy about me, does that mean my future is already decided? That I don't really get to choose what kind of person I become?" It was a remarkably sophisticated question, touching on fundamental issues of fate versus free will that had puzzled philosophers for centuries. "Not at all," Dumbledore said firmly. "Prophecies are not commands, Harry. They are possibilities, potential futures that might come to pass depending on the choices made by the many different people. The prophecy about you has already been partially fulfilled, in that you survived Voldemort's attack. What happens next depends entirely on the choices you make as you grow older." "Then I want to choose to be someone who protects people," Harry said with quiet determination. "Not because a prophecy says I should, but because it's the right thing to do." "Then that," Dumbledore said with a smile that seemed to light up the entire room, "is exactly the right foundation upon which to build whatever future awaits you." The conversation continued for another hour, touching on Harry's education, his developing magical abilities, and the various ways they could prepare him for whatever challenges might lie ahead. But the core message was clear. Harry would grow up knowing the truth about his circumstances, but he would also grow up with the knowledge that his future remained his own to choose. When Dumbledore finally departed, leaving behind promises to continue Harry's expanded educational opportunities and assurances that the family's privacy would continue to be protected, the house settled into the quiet peace of evening. Harry spent the rest of his birthday absorbed in the Potter family history book, occasionally calling Sirius or Remus over to explain a reference or ask about a particular ancestor. The stories seemed to fascinate him, not because they were about his family, but because they illustrated different ways magical people could contribute to the world. "Look," Harry said, pointing to a page about his great-great-grandmother. "Euphemia Potter developed a new healing technique that helped injured auras recover from curse damage faster. And here," he flipped several pages, James Potter II created a scholarship fund to help Muggle-born students afford Hogwarts supplies. What do you think about all of this? Sirius asked, settling beside Harry on the sitting room sofa as the sun set outside the windows. I think, Harry said slowly, that being a Potter means using whatever abilities you have to help other people. And that makes me proud to be one. Your parents would be so proud of you, Remus said quietly, joining them by the window where the last light of Harry's 7th birthday was fading into gentle dusk. I hope so, Harry said. I want to be the kind of person they would have wanted me to be. You already are, Sirius assured him. Every single day, you show us the best of both James and Lily. Their courage, their kindness, their determination to make the world better. As they prepared Harry for bed, a process that now included helping him organize his growing collection of advanced magical texts and his ever-expanding correspondence with friends from across the wizarding world, Sirius reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying day in November 1981, when he'd walked out of the Wizengamot chambers with custody of a traumatized 15-month-old. Harry had grown into exactly the kind of person James and Lily would have wanted him to be. Confident but humble, powerful but compassionate, famous but grounded in genuine relationships and real values. The prophecy that had shaped his early life might still influence his future, but it would not define him. Harry Potter would define himself. "Padfoot," Harry called as Sirius reached the bedroom door. "Thank you for the best 7th birthday ever. And for everything else, all the birthdays and all the days in between." "Thank you," Sirius replied, his voice rough with emotion, "for being exactly the son we always hoped you'd become." And as he closed the door on Harry's childhood bedroom, soon to be replaced by quarters more suitable for a young wizard preparing for the greater challenges of formal magical education, Sirius knew with absolute certainty that whatever the future held, they would face it together as the family they had chosen to become. The calm before Hogwarts was ending, but the foundation they had built would endure through whatever storms might come. Chapter 12. Legacy of Love and Choice. The morning sun streaming through the windows of Harry's bedroom at Grimold Place illuminated a space that had evolved considerably from the simple nursery Sirius and Remus had hastily prepared 7 years earlier. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with advanced texts on magical theory, international magical traditions, and collections of letters from friends across Europe. A desk by the window held carefully organized notes from his studies at Hogwarts, his ongoing correspondence with Severus Snape about advanced potions concepts, and a half-finished essay on the applications of defensive magic in everyday life. But on this particular morning, July 31st, 1988, Harry's 8th birthday, the usual scholarly atmosphere was overshadowed by the presence of an official-looking envelope sitting prominently on his bedside table. Harry sat cross-legged on his bed, staring at the letter with a mixture of excitement and trepidation that had been building since it had arrived with the post 3 days earlier. The thick parchment bore the Hogwarts seal, and everyone in the household knew what it represented. Harry's formal admission to the school he'd been attending part-time for over a year, but now as a full student despite being 3 years younger than the typical incoming class. "Still haven't opened it?" Remus asked from the doorway, his voice carrying the gentle amusement that had characterized so many of their morning conversations over the years. "I know what it says," Harry replied, his 8-year-old voice carrying a maturity that still occasionally startled adults who didn't know him well. "Professor McGonagall told us last month that the Hogwarts Board of Governors had approved my early admission. The letter is just making it official." "Then why the hesitation?" Harry looked up at Remus with the serious expression that meant he was working through complex emotions. "Because once I open it and read it out loud, everything changes. No more living at home most of the time. No more having Padfoot help me with my essays every evening. No more Uncle Mooney tucking me in and telling me stories about my parents." Remus settled on the edge of the bed, his presence immediately comforting in the way that 7 years of shared mornings had made automatic. "Harry, do you really think that living at Hogwarts is going to change how much Padfoot and I love you? Do you think it's going to make you less our son?" "No," Harry said quietly. "But it will change how much time we spend together. And what if I like it so much that I don't want to come home for holidays? What if I make friends who are more interesting than my family? What if I become someone different?" The fears were those of any 8-year-old facing a major life transition, but they carried additional weight given Harry's history. The boy who had been abandoned by his relatives, who had spent his first 15 months learning that adults couldn't be trusted to stay, still carried deep-seated anxieties about attachment and loss, despite 7 years of unwavering love and security. "Come here," Remus said gently, and Harry immediately curled up against his uncle's side in a gesture that had comforted him through countless childhood fears. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you," Remus continued, his voice soft with affection. "I see a boy who has grown up surrounded by love and has learned to love generously in return. I see someone who makes friends easily, but never forgets the people who matter most to him. I see a young wizard with remarkable abilities who has also developed remarkable compassion. How do you know I won't change? Because the person you are isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose, every day, in 100 small decisions. You choose to be kind to people who are struggling. You choose to study hard, not to show off, but because you genuinely want to understand how things work. You choose to help younger students who are having difficulty, even when you could just focus on your own advancement." Remus paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "Those choices aren't going to stop mattering just because you're living at Hogwarts. If anything, you'll have more opportunities to choose who you want to be." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sirius, who appeared in the doorway, carrying what appeared to be breakfast on a tray. Over the years, Sirius had developed into someone who could manage basic domestic magic with reasonable competence, though his attempts at elaborate cooking still sometimes resulted in interesting explosions. "Happy birthday, Harry," Sirius said, settling the tray on Harry's desk and revealing what was clearly his attempt at birthday pancakes. They were shaped vaguely like magical creatures and decorated with fruit arranged in patterns that probably meant something significant in advanced arithmancy. "Thank you, Padfoot," Harry said, his earlier melancholy lifting at the sight of Sirius's earnest domestic efforts. "Are those supposed to be dragons?" "Dragons, phoenixes, and what I hoped would be a hippogriff, but might actually be a very confused thestral," Sirius confirmed with mock solemnity. "I've been practicing." As Harry tackled his artistic breakfast, Sirius and Remus exchanged the kind of wordless communication that had developed between them over years of shared parenting. Both men were acutely aware that this birthday marked the end of an era, the conclusion of Harry's childhood as they had known it, and the beginning of his journey toward the independence that would eventually take him far beyond the protective walls of Grimmauld Place. "Harry," Sirius said, once the birthday pancakes had been appropriately appreciated, "there's something Remus and I want to talk to you about before you open your Hogwarts letter." Harry looked up with immediate attention, recognizing the tone that meant important family business was about to be discussed. "We want you to know," Sirius continued, "that no matter where you go to school, no matter how old you get, no matter what you accomplish or what challenges you face, you will always have a home here with us. This isn't just the place where you sleep when you're not at school. This is your home. We are your family. And that will never change. We know that Hogwarts is going to offer you opportunities we can't provide," Remus added. "Access to advanced magical education, friendships with peers who share your abilities and interests, experiences that will help you grow into the young man you're becoming. We want you to embrace all of that fully, without worrying about us or feeling guilty about growing up. But we also want you to know," Sirius said, his voice carrying the fierce protectiveness that had characterized his guardianship from the beginning, "that if you're ever unhappy, if you ever feel unsafe, if you ever just need to come home for any reason at all, you can. No questions asked, no consequences. Your well-being will always be more important to us than any educational opportunity." Harry listened to these assurances with the focused attention he gave to all serious family conversations. When they finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, processing what he'd heard. "You're afraid too," he said finally, and it wasn't a question. "Terrified," Sirius admitted, with the honesty that had always characterized their family communications. "We've had you to ourselves for 7 years, Harry. We've been able to protect you, guide you, make sure you're safe and happy and loved every single day. Now we're going to be trusting other people with the most precious thing in our world. But we're also proud," Remus added, "incredibly proud of the person you've become and excited about the person you're still becoming. You're ready for Hogwarts, Harry, in ways that go far beyond your magical abilities or academic achievements. You're ready because you know who you are and what you value, and those things will guide you no matter where you go." Harry climbed out of bed and retrieved the Hogwarts letter from his bedside table, holding it carefully in both hands. "Then I think it's time," he said with quiet determination. They gathered in the sitting room, where so many important family moments had taken place over the years, the same room where Harry had taken his first steps, learned his first words, worked through countless homework assignments, and had hundreds of conversations about everything from magical theory to playground politics. Harry broke the Hogwarts seal with ceremonial care and unfolded the parchment, his voice clear and steady as he read the formal language of admission. "Dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, effective September 1st, 1988. As discussed in previous correspondence regarding your exceptional circumstances, you will be entering as a third-year student, despite your chronological age, with a modified curriculum designed to challenge your advanced abilities while supporting your continued development." Harry paused in his reading to look up at his guardians. "Third year," he said with a mixture of pride and nervousness. "That means I'll be studying with students who are 13 and 14 years old. It also means," Sirius pointed out, "that Professor McGonagall and the other faculty members believe you're ready to handle that level of academic and social challenge. They wouldn't have approved early admission if they had any doubts about your ability to succeed." Harry continued reading the letter, which detailed his course schedule, dormitory assignment, a special arrangement that would allow him more privacy and supervision given his age, and various other practical matters related to his unique situation. As he read, Sirius reflected on the remarkable transformation that had brought them to this moment. 7 years earlier, he had been a broken young man taking custody of a traumatized toddler, with no idea how to be a parent and no clear vision of what Harry's future might hold. Now he was watching that toddler, grown into a confident, compassionate, intellectually gifted 8-year-old, prepare to take the next step in what was already shaping up to be an extraordinary life. The Harry Potter who would enter Hogwarts in September bore little resemblance to the Harry Potter of the original timeline. This Harry had never known hunger or neglect, had never been told he was unwanted or freakish, had never learned to make himself small and invisible to avoid punishment. Instead, he had grown up surrounded by love, encouragement, intellectual stimulation, and the consistent message that he was valued not for his fame, but for himself. The differences showed in everything from his posture, confident and open rather than defensive and withdrawn, to his relationships with adults, whom he trusted instinctively rather than feared. Where the canonical Harry had learned to be suspicious of positive attention and to downplay his own abilities, this Harry had been taught to be proud of his gifts while remaining humble about his limitations. "There's one more thing," Remus said, as Harry finished reading the letter. "Professor Dumbledore included a separate note that I think you should hear." He produced a smaller piece of parchment from his robes and read, "Dear Harry, as you prepare to begin your formal education at Hogwarts, I want you to know how much joy it brings me to see the remarkable young man you have become. Your parents would be tremendously proud, not only of your magical abilities and academic achievements, but of your kindness, your courage, and your unwavering commitment to using your gifts in service of others. Hogwarts will offer you many opportunities to continue growing, but the foundation of love and wisdom that Sirius and Remus have provided will remain your greatest strength. Welcome to Hogwarts, Mr. Potter. I look forward to watching you flourish." Harry was quiet for a long moment after Remus finished reading, his 8-year-old mind processing the weight of this transition and everything it represented. "I want to go," he said finally, his voice steady with decision. "I want to learn everything I can, meet other students who love magic as much as I do, and see what I'm capable of becoming. But I also want to come home for dinner every Sunday, and for holidays and whenever I miss you too much to concentrate on my studies." "Done," Sirius said immediately. "And I want to keep writing letters to all of you every day, so you know what I'm learning and thinking about." "We'll write back just as often," Remus promised. "And I want you to visit me at school sometimes, so my new friends can meet the people who taught me everything important." "Try and stop us," Sirius said with a grin that was equal parts pride and determination. They spent the rest of Harry's birthday planning for his Hogwarts transition, discussing practical matters like what additional books he might need, how to maintain his international correspondence while at school, and which of his many projects and interests he wanted to continue pursuing during the academic year. But more importantly, they talked about the deeper questions: how Harry wanted to present himself to his new classmates, what aspects of his rather unique upbringing he felt comfortable sharing, and how he envisioned balancing his academic pursuits with his social development. "I think," Harry said as the afternoon sun began to slant through the sitting room windows, "that I want people to know me as Harry first and Harry Potter second. I want to make friends because they like spending time with me, not because they're curious about my scar." "That's exactly the right approach," Remus approved. "Your fame is part of your history, but it doesn't have to define your future relationships." "And if some people only want to be friends because you're famous," Sirius added, "then they're not really friends worth having anyway." As the day wound toward evening, they established what Harry dubbed their Hogwarts family traditions: the Sunday dinners that would remain inviolate, the daily correspondence that would keep them connected, and the promise that any major decisions about Harry's education or future would continue to be made together as a family, regardless of physical distance. "You know," Harry said as they prepared for the birthday dinner that would conclude his 8th birthday celebration, "I used to worry that growing up meant leaving you behind. But now I think it means taking everything you've taught me and using it to become someone you'll be proud of." "We're already proud of you," Sirius said, pulling Harry into one of the fierce hugs that had punctuated important moments throughout his childhood. "Every single day, you make us proud just by being exactly who you are." "And now," Remus added, joining the embrace, "you get to take that wonderful person out into the world and see what amazing things you can accomplish." That evening, as they read Harry's Hogwarts letter one more time and began making lists of everything they would need to accomplish before September, Sirius found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The terrified young man who had once stood in a ministry holding cell accused of murdering his best friends could never have imagined that 7 years later he would be sitting in his own home, surrounded by family, planning for the bright future of the child he had been blessed to raise. Harry Potter would enter Hogwarts as a confident, capable, deeply loved 8-year-old with advanced magical abilities, strong moral foundations, and an unshakable knowledge of his own worth. He would face the challenges ahead, not as a lonely, traumatized survivor, but as a cherished son supported by a family that would always be there for him. And perhaps most importantly, he would face those challenges with the knowledge that love and choice, not prophecy or destiny, had shaped his life and would continue to shape his future. "Tomorrow," Harry announced as they finally concluded their planning session, "we start getting ready for Hogwarts." "Tomorrow," Sirius agreed, "we start the next chapter of our adventure together." It was, Harry thought as he drifted off to sleep that night, exactly the kind of future his parents would have wanted for him. Filled with possibility, grounded in love, and shaped by the choices he would make as he grew into the person he was meant to become. And in the quiet house at Grimold Place, two men who had learned to be fathers watched over the sleeping child who had taught them what family truly meant, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future held, they would face it together.